When we take a closer look at the Celtic-speaking peoples of history, something surprising appears. They were not all one physical type. Among them we find short and dark individuals, tall and fair Highlanders and Welshmen, broad-headed Bretons, and many different Irish types. Even men with clear Norse names and a Scandinavian look sometimes spoke Gaelic fluently. Physically, they were diverse, but culturally and psychologically, they often shared a recognizable temperament. This suggests something powerful. Even if there was no single Celtic race in a strict biological sense, there was a strong cultural force that shaped everyone who came into contact with it. Over time, that influence blended different communities into a common identity. You can sometimes see traces of it in places where no Celtic language survives today. It can even surface unexpectedly in someone who thinks of himself as entirely Anglo-Saxon, revealing a forgotten Celtic layer in the past. Now, let's break down the two major ideas scholars have proposed about Celtic origins. The first theory connects the Celts to what anthropologists once called the Alpine type of Central Europe, generally shorter, broad-headed people who were already present in the Neolithic period. This physical type appears among certain Slavic populations in parts of Germany and Scandinavia, and in regions of France historically associated with the ancient Celtae. Archaeological finds from prehistoric graves in Belgium and France seem to support this. Some scholars even argued that this group formed part of a wider Eurasiatic population and may have been linked to early Indo-European language spread. According to this view, these people either brought Celtic speech into Europe or adopted and passed it on. Later, waves of newcomers, including groups known to the Romans as the Belgi, may have taken over territory, adopted Celtic language themselves, and further reshaped the population. Another version of this argument suggests that the darker, broad-headed people described in parts of ancient Gaul were not originally Celtic at all, but were conquered by taller, fairer invaders who imposed their language on them. Over time, the two groups mixed. Before that, these same populations had already blended with even older inhabitants of Gaul, long-headed Mediterranean or Iberian peoples. In regions like Aquitaine, these older groups may have remained more distinct for longer. But here is where the debate becomes even more complicated. Ancient Roman writers such as Julius Caesar described the Gauls, who called themselves Celtae, as tall and fair. They even note that the Gauls looked down on the shorter Romans. Other classical authors also describe the Celts and Belgae as similar in appearance, tall, strong, and light-featured. None of them describe the Celts as short and dark. If short, dark populations were observed, they were usually labelled Iberian, not Celtic. It is important to remember that ancient observers were not measuring skulls or classifying people the way later anthropologists did. They described what they saw in broad, visual terms. Over time, however, the physical appearance of populations in France and surrounding regions shifted. This may be explained by simple demographics. If a smaller number of tall, fair Celtic warriors conquered and ruled over larger local populations, intermarriage would gradually produce a blended society. The traits of the more numerous group would naturally become dominant. Even by Caesar's time, the darker and broader-headed population may already have outnumbered the original Celtic elite. But Roman writers, encountering the most striking examples, the tall, fair warriors, may have generalized from them. The second major theory moves in a different direction. It sees the Gauls and the Belgae as part of a large, tall, fair Celtic people who once stretched across an enormous area, from Ireland all the way to Asia Minor, from northern Germany to northern Italy. In this view, The Celts were not a small alpine group, but a dominant force across much of Europe before the rise of Germanic tribes pushed them westward. Some Belgic tribes even claimed German ancestry. But the ancient term German was not always used precisely. It may not have meant what we understand today as strictly Germanic. Because the Celts were described as fair-haired, some historians once assumed they were closely related to the Germanic tribes. But fairness is relative. To darker Mediterranean Romans, even brown hair could appear fair. And although Celts and Germans lived side by side for centuries, their religious systems, social institutions, and priesthoods were clearly different. Their languages, while both Indo-European, diverged significantly. In fact, Celtic appears linguistically closer to Italic than to Germanic, suggesting a long shared development between early Italic and Celtic groups before they split apart. When we compare historical character descriptions, the difference becomes clearer. The typical Germanic warrior and the typical Celtic warrior were portrayed with different temperaments and social structures. Even within the British Isles, contrasts can be drawn between eastern regions, with stronger Germanic heritage and Western Highland areas shaped by Celtic culture. Finally, the question of skull types, long-headed, broad-headed, or somewhere in between, does not give us clear answers. The archaeological evidence is too limited to support firm conclusions. Some Iron Age skulls in Britain are long-headed, others in continental regions are broader. Mixing between populations likely blurred the distinctions long ago. What we are left with is not a simple racial story, but a complex web of migration, conquest, cultural transmission, and intermarriage. The round barrows often linked to early Celtic groups. Most of them are broad-headed. Some of the strongest examples resemble even older Neolithic skulls found in places like Grenelle, Seleno, and Borreby, although the Bronze Age individuals were generally shorter in height. This has led different researchers to very different conclusions. Some argued that later arrivals, such as the Belgi, reinforced or mixed with these earlier broad-headed communities. Others believed these round barrow people were themselves closely connected to continental groups, sometimes labelled as Cymri. Still others linked them to what was once called the Alpine population of Central Europe. But here's the real question. Can a few hundred skulls truly explain the identity of entire peoples, who lived and changed over thousands of years? Even if there was once a more distinct Celtic physical type in very ancient times, by the period we actually know from history, the Celts were already a mixed population. They had blended with earlier European inhabitants, long-headed Mediterranean groups, broad-headed Neolithic communities, and others. Some individuals we would call Gauls or Belgae appear long-skulled, others broad-skulled. Hair colour and height also varied. Ancient writers probably described the most visible and dominant classes, likely taller and fairer elites, and assumed that represented everyone. They rarely described the ordinary population in detail. Irish tradition itself speaks of two different stocks living side by side. One tall, fair, and blue-eyed. The other shorter, darker, and dark-eyed. Diversity was already part of the story. And when we step even further back to the supposed Indo-European homeland on the Eurasian steppe, things become even less certain. The idea of a single original Aryan type is far too simple. The people who carried early Indo-European speech westward may already have differed in physical appearance, so by the time Celtic-speaking groups began expanding across Europe, they were probably not racially uniform at all. What united them was not skull shape, but language, religion, and shared social structures. Before their great migrations across Central and Western Europe, these early Celtic groups may already have been mixed. even if their warrior elites retained a more consistent appearance. As they moved into Gaul, Iberia, and eventually Britain, they intermarried with local populations. In Gaul, they encountered descendants of very ancient Paleolithic groups, Iberians, Ligurians, and other long-established communities. By the time the first Celtic-speaking settlers reached Britain, the Goidels, they were already a blended people. Later arrivals, such as the Brythonic groups, were probably even more mixed, possibly influenced by contact with Germanic tribes. That is why, among Celtic-speaking populations and their descendants, we see enormous physical variation. Broad-headed Bretons, tall red-haired Highlanders, chestnut-haired Welshmen, Irish communities with Norse ancestry, darker Highlanders, and many more combinations. Yet across this diversity, observers often noticed something recognisably Celtic in expression and temperament. This shared cultural face, a kind of common identity, seems to have survived regardless of physical variation. It was powerful enough to shape different populations who adopted Celtic speech and ways of life. Historical observers described Celtic-speaking peoples as expressive, talkative, imaginative, emotional, loyal to family, deeply attached to homeland, romantic in outlook, strongly religious, sometimes even sliding into superstition, and relatively strict in certain moral standards. Whether these descriptions are stereotypes or not, they show that what stood out to outsiders was cultural character, not skull measurements. Language offers clearer clues than bones. Early Celtic speech lost the initial P sound, found in older Indo-European words. For example, the word that became Latin pater appeared in early Celtic without the P sound, giving forms like Irish ather. Similarly, Latin pistis became Irish iasg. Even super became something like for in Irish. This sound change happened before certain Celtic groups moved into Britain, likely before 1000 BCE, and while Celts were still interacting with Germanic peoples because Germanic languages borrowed Celtic words that already showed this shift. Later, another major sound change divided Celtic speech into two branches. The Goidelic branch, including Irish, Scottish Gaelic, and Manx, preserved an older Q or K sound. The other branch, often called Brythonic, changed that sound into phi. For example, the word for horse appears as ek in Old Irish, but became epos in Gaulish. Tribal names and place names reflect this difference. This linguistic split is one of the clearest markers separating Celtic-speaking groups. The Picts of northern Britain add another layer of complexity. Were they pre-Indo-European people influenced by Celts? Were they Goidelic speakers with Brythonic features? Or were they a Brythonic group pushed northward by later migrations? Their language seems to have leaned more toward the Brythonic pattern, but the evidence is fragmentary. What is certain is that Goidelic-speaking groups were present in Gaul and Spain before reaching Britain and Ireland. Archaeology and Irish tradition both support this. Some scholars have argued that the Goidels did not originally settle Britain from the continent at all. According to this view, they first established themselves in Ireland, and only later crossed back into Britain around the 2nd century. Others went even further, suggesting that most of England, apart from places like Wales and Cornwall, shows no clear Goidelic presence at all, pointing instead to Brythonic place names. But there's a practical problem with that idea. If at least some Goidels clearly reached Ireland from the continent, then geographically Britain would have been an easier first stop. It sits directly between mainland Europe and Ireland. It makes sense that migrating groups would have passed through or settled there before moving westward. Over time, major place names might have been reshaped into Brythonic forms, especially under later political dominance. But smaller, less important locations could easily have preserved older Goidelic forms, and those minor names may hold the real clues. There's also an intriguing linguistic hint. The ancient name Cassiterides, used in reference to Britain and associated with tin trade, belongs to the so-called Q group of Celtic speech. That detail suggests that early Celtic speakers who preserved the older Q sound may have been present in Britain as early as the 9th century BCE. If that is true, then Britain may initially have been called something like Curitani or Curitani. Later, incoming groups who shifted the Q sound into P could have transformed that into Prytani, a name that survives in Welsh tradition and echoes in the Greek term for the British Isles. Interestingly, when Pictish groups reached Ireland, Irish Goidels referred to them with a name that connects back to this same root. So who exactly were the Picts? The name Picti, used by the Romans, may come from a word meaning the engraved ones, or the tattooed. Body marking, through tattooing, painting or scarification, was definitely practiced in ancient Britain. But this doesn't necessarily indicate a separate racial group. Tattooing was also practiced by other Celtic-speaking peoples, and British tribes famously dyed themselves with woad. These practices were likely decorative, symbolic, or intended to project fierceness in battle, not markers of ethnic difference. By the late Roman period, the Picts had become known as fierce northern enemies. Roman writers grouped northern tribes under names like Caledonii and other Picts. Many of the tribal names recorded in northern Britain show clear Brythonic linguistic patterns. Place names and personal names associated with Pictish areas also resemble Brythonic forms. That has led many scholars to suggest that the Picts likely spoke a Brythonic dialect rather than a completely separate language. The fact that St. Columba reportedly required an interpreter when preaching among them could reflect dialect differences rather than a completely different language family. Later still, Irish Goidelic-speaking groups, the Scotti, expanded into Pictish territory. But by that time, the Picts themselves were almost certainly already mixed with earlier populations and possibly with earlier Goidelic settlers in Britain. Some unusual customs attributed to them, like inheritance patterns through the female line, may not have been uniquely non-Celtic. In fact, similar practices appear elsewhere in Celtic tradition. Even Roman writers mention that certain British tribes shared wives, a reminder that ancient social structures were far more fluid than later historians once assumed. One Roman description of the Caledonii, often linked to the Picts, portrays them as large-limbed and red-haired, hardly matching the stereotype of a short, dark, pre-Celtic population. All of this makes the Pictish question deeply complex. The evidence is fragmentary, and the mystery remains open. What we can say with confidence is that they practiced pre-battle sacrifice and had Druids, both unmistakably Celtic features. Now let's zoom out to the bigger picture. Where did the Celts first emerge? The earliest identifiable Celtic cultural zone seems to have been in the region between the Upper Rhine, the Elbe, and the Danube. Somewhere in this broad Central European corridor, during the later prehistoric period, Celtic speech began developing as a distinct branch of Indo-European. Greek writers may have referred to these northern peoples in semi-legendary terms, perhaps even connecting them with the mysterious Hyperboreans. By the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, however, they were clearly known as Celts or Galatae. The Romans typically called them Galli, a name eventually associated specifically with Gaul. From this relatively compact homeland, successive waves of Celtic expansion transformed much of Europe. Before 300 BCE, Celtic-speaking peoples occupied the British Isles, large parts of Iberia, Gaul, northern Italy, Belgium, the Low Countries, much of Germany and Austria, and even parts of the Balkans. When pressure from Germanic tribes intensified, some Celtic groups moved into Asia Minor, where they became known as the Galatians. Archaeology supports this vast spread. Celtic-style artifacts appear across these regions. But perhaps even more striking is the evidence of place names. The Celtic word dunon, meaning fort or stronghold, appears from Ireland all the way into Eastern Europe. The term magos, meaning field or plain, shows up across Britain, France, Switzerland, Italy, and beyond. Even mountain and river names carry shared roots. The Pennines in Britain share their name with the Apennines in Italy. Rivers associated with divine identity, names derived from roots meaning God, appear both in Britain and on the continent. But did all these Celtic regions form a single political empire under one ruler? Not in the modern sense. There was no centralized state stretching from Ireland to the Balkans. However, ancient sources preserve a legend of a powerful ruler named Ambecatus, said to have governed a vast Celtic realm and to have sent relatives to found new settlements in Italy and deep forests of Central Europe. Whether literal or mythic, this story suggests at least the idea of hegemony, one dominant tribe or leader exerting influence over others. In Gaul, certain tribes like the Arverni claimed supremacy over neighbouring peoples. In Belgium, the Suessiones held a leadership position among surrounding tribes. In Ireland, the institution of the High King symbolised a hierarchy among regional rulers. In Galatia, tribal unity was maintained through councils and regular assemblies. So while there was no permanent empire, there were moments and regions of coordinated power. Religious unity likely played a major role. If the Druids already functioned as a trans-tribal priestly class, they would have reinforced shared identity across regions. Myths of past greatness, like the story of Ambecatus, may have helped maintain a sense of collective destiny. Roman authorities certainly recognized the power of that unity. They worked deliberately to weaken intertribal cohesion and suppress the Druids, seeing them as a threat. But geography and migration worked against long-term centralization. The Celts expanded rapidly and scattered widely. Their cohesion weakened as Germanic tribes revolted and Rome advanced. In the end, Roman conquest completed what internal fragmentation had begun. Let's turn now to what Roman observers tell us about Celtic religion. When Julius Caesar described the gods of Gaul, he translated them into Roman terms. He wrote that the Gauls worshipped Mercury above all, seeing him as the inventor of the arts, the protector of travellers, and a powerful force in trade and business. After him came Apollo, Mars, Jupiter, and Minerva. Apollo healed disease, Minerva taught skills and crafts, Jupiter ruled the sky, and Mars governed war. Caesar also claimed that the Gauls believed they were descended from a god he called Dispater. But we have to pause here. These were not Roman gods in the strict sense. Caesar was using Roman names to describe Celtic deities. Just as Greek writers identified Egyptian or Persian gods with Zeus or Athena, Romans did the same with Celtic gods. The match was rarely exact. Usually, the identification was based on one shared function. A Celtic healing god might be labelled Apollo. A thunder god might become Jupiter. A war god might be called Mars. The translation made Celtic religion easier for Roman audiences to understand. In Gaul, however, this was more than a literary shortcut. It was also political. Roman authorities encouraged the blending of cults. By associating Celtic gods with Roman ones, they weakened the independent authority of the Druids and helped integrate Gaul into Roman religious life. The Gauls themselves adapted quickly. thousands of inscriptions show gods with double identities. A Roman name paired with a Celtic one. You might see something like Jupiter Taranis or Apollo Granus. Sometimes the Roman name appears with a local Celtic epithet. Other times, the Celtic name stands alone. Art also played a role in this transformation. Many Celtic gods began to be represented in Greco-Roman artistic style. A native deity might appear dressed like a Roman god, but holding a distinctly Celtic symbol. Occasionally, however, we still see fully native forms, such as the horned god Cernunnos, who does not neatly fit into a Roman mould. Over time, this blending reshaped Celtic paganism, even before Christianity arrived in Gaul. Roman gods were worshipped not only by Roman settlers, but also by the Gauls themselves. In addition, Eastern cults popular in the Roman world left traces in Gaul as well. It's important to understand how diverse the Celtic religious landscape was. There were likely many local gods, gods of roads, trade, crafts, healing springs, forests, tribal territories, and more. Each might carry a different name in different regions. When the Romans identified them with Mercury, Mars, or Minerva, they were often grouping many distinct local deities under one familiar label. Inscriptions show just how numerous these local gods were. Many appear only once in surviving records, suggesting that devotion was often intensely local. Take the case of the god identified with Mercury. Archaeological evidence shows that this figure was extremely popular in Gaul. Temples dedicated to him existed in several regions, especially among the Allobroges. Bronze statuettes of this Mercury have been found in large numbers. A massive statue was even erected in a major sanctuary used by the Arverni. But this Mercury was not necessarily the supreme god in every context. In times of war, native war deities would have taken center stage. The name Mercury likely covered a range of local gods with different aspects. Some names appear to be tied to specific places. Others reflect particular functions. One title, Artaios, has been linked either to a word for god, to bear, or possibly to cultivated land, suggesting a connection with agriculture. An inscription to Mercurius Cultor supports the idea that agricultural deities were sometimes absorbed into this Mercury figure. Another example is a god called Moccus, whose name relates to swine. The pig had deep symbolic meaning in Celtic Europe. In many traditions, swine were linked to fertility and vegetation. In some agricultural rituals, pork was buried in fields or mixed with seed to promote growth. Over time, what may have once been a sacred animal symbol became personified as a fertility god. That god, too, was identified with Mercury, perhaps because the Roman god Hermes, equivalent to Mercury, was associated with prosperity and fertility in livestock. All of this shows us something crucial. Celtic religion was not centered on a small, rigid pantheon. It was fluid, local, and adaptable. Major gods may have been widely recognized, but local spirits and tribal deities played a central role in everyday life. When Rome arrived, instead of erasing this system, it layered Roman terminology and imagery over it. The result was a hybrid religious world, Celtic in origin, Roman in expression. Let's continue exploring the Celtic religious world, and this time we're diving deeper into the gods connected to everyday life, war, the sky, and even the underworld. As trade expanded in Gaul, religion adapted to reflect it. Commerce was central to settled Celtic communities, and that meant roads, borders, and marketplaces became sacred spaces. We even find inscriptions dedicated to a god described as the inventor of roads and paths. Other local road deities were identified with the Roman Mercury. These were protectors of travellers and merchants. divine guardians of movement and exchange. One fascinating figure is Ogmios. A striking image survives. A powerful older god who draws people toward him with chains attached to his tongue. The message is clear, he rules through speech. Classical writers compared him to Heracles, but his deeper connection is to the Celtic Ogma. He is not a muscle-bound hero, he is a god of eloquence. Among early societies, speech was power. The ability to persuade, inspire, or command through words was sacred. In that sense, Ogmios resembles Mercury not as a trader, but as a bringer of culture and communication. Mercury in Gaul was not one single figure. Many local gods, tied to farming, trade, crafts, and travel, were absorbed into this Roman label. Some were worshipped on hilltops, reflecting a long-standing Celtic connection between divine power and high places. One title of this god links directly to the Celtic word for hill or mound. In Ireland too, ancient gods were associated with sacred mounds. Healing was another powerful divine domain. Several Celtic gods were identified with Apollo, especially in his role as healer and bringer of light. These two aspects often overlapped. For example, Granos was a god connected to thermal springs across Britain and the continent. His name relates to ideas of burning and shining, and even connects to the Irish word for sun. In parts of France, echoes of his worship survived in folk rituals, where burning sheaves of corn were called out in his name. That blend of fire, sun, and healing reveals how closely fertility and health were linked. Another spring god, Borvo or Bormanus, took his name from words meaning boiling. The bubbling waters themselves were sacred. People left votive tablets asking these gods for healing. For Celtic communities, hot springs were not just natural wonders. They were places where divine power touched the earth. Then, there is Belanos, the Shining One. His cult stretched across a wide region, especially in northern Italy. He appears to have been a sun god, and like other solar deities, he was associated with light, warmth, fertility, and health. His name appears in place names and personal names, showing how widespread his worship was. Plants were even named after him, believed to carry healing power. In Celtic belief, sunlight and fertility naturally flowed into ideas of vitality and well-being. Other gods connected to youth and strength also appear. Mapanos, whose name suggests the youthful one, was identified with Apollo and appears in both Britain and Gaul. Another figure, Mogons or Magunos, carries a name tied to growth or increase. He may have been another form of a sun god or possibly a sky god. Either way, he represented strength and rising power. War, of course, had its own divine guardians. Around 60 names of war gods survive in inscriptions. Most were equated with Mars. These were often tribal protectors, fierce embodiments of the community's fighting spirit. Some names translate roughly as Battle King, King of the World, or Mighty in Slaughter. These were not abstract gods. They were imagined as leading their people into combat. One particularly important figure is Teutatis, whose name connects directly to the word for tribe. He was likely a tribal war god, a divine embodiment of the people in their warlike form. Ancient writers mention him alongside other major Celtic gods, like Tyrannus and Essus. Whether these were truly universal pan-Celtic gods is debated, but they clearly held major significance. Even unexpected domains could become divine. One Gaulish god connected to malt and brewing was identified with Mars. The Celts were known for their strong drink, both imported wine and their own malt-based beverages. Words for these drinks survive in Irish and continental sources. Intoxication, especially the ecstatic frenzy it produced, could be seen as sacred. This god personified the raw substance that produced that divine state. Why Mars? Perhaps because frenzy, battle, and intoxication were symbolically linked. Turning upward to the sky, Caesar said, "The Celtic Jupiter ruled the heavens. Several deities were equated with him. One carried a wheel, almost certainly a solar symbol. Another was Taranis, a thunder god whose name connects directly to Celtic words for thunder. On altars dedicated to Jupiter, we often see both a wheel and a thunderbolt, carved side by side. The wheel symbol appears widely across Celtic lands, and was even worn as an amulet. At midsummer festivals, blazing wheels were rolled downhill, symbolising the sun's power. Thunder, lightning, and the sun were closely connected in ancient imagination. Lightning was often seen as a spark from the sun. The figure of Taranis is especially interesting. Some ancient commentators linked him to Jupiter, others to a darker underworld god. But inscriptions suggest he was primarily a thunder god. It's important not to confuse him automatically with another major figure, the hammer-bearing god often called Suchelos. The hammer god is one of the most distinctive Celtic divine types. He appears as a bearded man in Celtic dress, carrying a long-handled hammer and often a cup. His image blends Celtic identity with artistic influence from Mediterranean underworld gods, like Pluto or Serapis. The hammer itself is an ancient symbol. Long before metal weapons, stone axes and hammers represented force and power. Across many cultures, the axe or hammer became a sacred emblem of supernatural strength. For the Celts, the hammer likely symbolized creative power rather than simple destruction. This god was associated with the underworld, fertility, and possibly ancestry. In some depictions, he carries a grain measure or vessel, linking him to agricultural abundance. He was not merely a god of death, but a god of life emerging from the earth. A chthonic figure who ruled beneath yet nourished above. Another powerful image is Cernunnos, the horned god. On a famous altar from Paris, he appears seated, with antlers from which hang torques, the sacred neck rings of Celtic nobility. Other sculptures show similar horned figures, holding bags of grain, feeding animals, or surrounded by serpents and wild creatures. In one image, grain spills from his bag while a stag and an ox feed beside him. In another, he offers abundance to a serpent. These images suggest fertility, wealth, the natural world, and cycles of life. The horned imagery connects him to wild animals and the forest, but the grain and cornucopia connect him equally to agriculture and prosperity. He is not simply a nature god in the modern sense, he is a symbol of life force itself. What emerges from all of this is a religious world that is layered, local, and dynamic. The Romans may have labelled Celtic gods as Mercury, Apollo, Mars, or Jupiter, but beneath those names were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of local divine personalities. Some ruled trade, some healing springs, some war, some the sun, some the underworld, and some the fertile earth. In some images, Cernunnos appears as a squatting god with antlers, a torque around his neck, and sometimes even a strange ram-headed serpent nearby. In other cases, a horned god stands inside a three-figure scene, as if we're seeing one moment from a larger sacred story. Sometimes, there's a three-headed god too, and it's not always obvious whether that's the same being as the horned one, or a different god altogether. The symbols overlap so much that it's hard to say what is one god with many faces, and what is several gods sharing the same visual language. Horns, torques, serpents, and even triple heads may have been used for more than one deity, even if they most often point back to Cernunnos. People have argued about why he's shown squatting. Some tried to link the pose to foreign influences. But there's also a simple, very Celtic explanation. Ancient Gauls often sat in a squatting posture rather than using chairs. So if this god was imagined as a tribal ancestor or underworld lord, artists may have portrayed him in the familiar way a Gaul would sit. The horns themselves likely signalled power. Chiefs were said to wear horned helmets, but they may also preserve an older layer of belief. The idea that this god used to be an animal divinity before becoming human-shaped in art. That would explain why animals keep appearing around him. In many religions, once a god becomes more human, the original animal form doesn't vanish. It stays as an attendant, a symbol, or a sacred companion. The ram-headed serpent is the strangest piece of the puzzle. Serpents are classic, below-the-ground creatures in ancient symbolism, tied to the earth, the dead, and hidden power. That suggests we're not just looking at a forest god. We're looking at a figure connected to fertility and the underworld at the same time, because for early societies those ideas belong together. Life rises from the earth, and the dead return to it. The bag or purse that appears in some scenes pushes the meaning even further. Yes, it can echo Mercury and wealth, but it also fits an underworld ruler like Pluto, the one who owns the riches beneath the ground, grain, metals, and prosperity. The talk adds another layer. Warriors offered talks to the gods, and a talk could symbolize strength and honor transferred from human victory into divine power. The triple head imagery may sound odd, but it doesn't have to be foreign. The Celts had a strong head cult. They treated the human head as a vessel of power, protection, and presence. Stories speak of severed heads that still speak, or sacred heads that defend a land. In that worldview, multiplying a divine head into 3 could be the ultimate protective symbol, watching in every direction like a supernatural guardian. So what are these monuments showing us? Probably not a neat family tree of gods, but a set of sacred scenes. The horned or 3-headed figure looks like the central character, while the other gods, male, female, or mixed, may represent companions from lost myths. And when we look at the repeated symbols of grain, cornucopia, bags of abundance, and animals feeding, the message feels consistent. This is a god of plenty. From there, the next step is almost unavoidable. A god of abundance in ancient thought is usually also a god of the earth, and the earth is also the underworld. That means Cernunnos may have functioned as a local version of the god Caesar, called Dispata, a deep earth lord tied to fertility, wealth, and ancestry. Interestingly, Cernunnos images are not most common in the same areas where the hammer god type dominates. That supports the idea that the Celts may have imagined the under-earth ancestor in different ways depending on region. In one place, the hammer-bearing underworld benefactor. In another, the horned, squatting giver of abundance. Some carvings complicate things further. There's a scene where a god attacks a serpent with a club. If the serpent is an older underworld symbol, the attack could reflect a local myth, where the underworld lord becomes separate from the serpent tradition, turning the serpent from companion into enemy. In other areas, like with Cernunnos, the serpent remains close, still part of his power. The key point is this: the Celtic underworld was not automatically imagined as a dark hell. It was the place life comes from and returns to, a hidden realm that feeds the world. If people believed humans emerged from beneath the earth long ago, then the ruler of that realm could easily become the ancestor of the living. Now, the story gets even more layered when we look at other figures sometimes pulled into the same orbit. A god shown with a cup and a heavy tool has been linked to a figure called Isus, and also to Roman Silvanus. But these Roman labels can be misleading. Sometimes artists matched gods just because of superficial similarities, like a wolfskin garment, while still keeping the native symbols such as the cup and hammer. And because this Celtic under-earth god was also tied to fertility, forests, and growth, he could be blended with a woodland deity in Roman eyes. In a few cases, inscriptions even hint that a native name may have existed behind the Roman one, suggesting a local god of wealth or possession, where wealth meant cattle and herds. Exactly the kind of riches believed to come from the Otherworld in Celtic myth. And then there's Isus himself, shown as a divine woodcutter striking at a tree. Nearby appears a bull with 3 birds. It's clearly a snapshot from a sacred storyline we no longer fully understand. But the pattern is familiar across many ancient religions. A god once represented by an animal or a tree becomes separated from that form, and the old ritual killing of the representative turns into myth. The god is said to destroy the bull, or cut the sacred tree. In this kind of belief system, the destruction is not random violence. It's a fertility act, a dramatic reset meant to keep life flowing. Even with all these names, the big warning still stands. We should not assume there was one universal Celtic trinity worshipped everywhere. The evidence points more strongly to powerful regional gods that could be famous in certain zones, but not necessarily dominant across the entire Celtic world. Finally, Celtic religion wasn't only about big gods. It was also deeply tied to place. Mountains were sacred, and some mountain gods were identified with Jupiter. Groups of unnamed gods guarded territories. Towns had protective spirits. Rivers and springs were divine personalities, not just landscapes. Founding a settlement meant placing it under a sacred protector, and people fought not only for land, but for the god who lived with the land. And when we shift to the goddesses, the picture becomes even richer. Celtic goddesses appear both as individuals and as groups, and the grouped mother figures were especially widespread. Many likely began as ancient earth mothers, then expanded into guardians of fertility, craft, healing, and even war. Some were linked to Minerva and resemble the Irish Bridget, culture goddesses tied to fire, skill, and civilization. Others were war goddesses, invoked with terrifying ritual intensity. Others ruled hunting and forests, riding wild animals, leading invisible hosts through the night in later folklore. And many, perhaps most, were water spirits, goddesses of rivers, springs, and healing wells whose names still echo in the geography of Europe. Across the Celtic world, inscriptions repeatedly call on a group known in Roman-style wording as the Dei Matres, the mother goddesses. Their worship spread so widely that even Germanic peoples adopted it. In art, they almost always appear as 3 women, calmly holding symbols of life. Fruit, flowers, a cornucopia, or sometimes a baby. The meaning is hard to miss. These are guardians of fertility, abundance, and the continuity of the family line. Behind this trio, there is probably an older and deeper belief. The idea of one great mother, the earth itself, imagined as a living being who feeds everything that grows. In some places, that older mother may have survived under different names and images, such as a goddess whose statue was carried through fields to wake up fertility, or other female divinities linked with grain and seasonal renewal. But over time, many religions show the same shift. The great Earth Mother slowly steps back, and an earth or under-earth male figure rises into prominence, a lord of fertility and the dead, like the Celtic underworld ancestor god. In that process, the mother doesn't vanish. She becomes a partner figure, appearing beside him with a cornucopia or a basket of fruit, still broadcasting the same message. growth, nourishment, plenty. So why are the mothers shown as 3? No single answer is certain, but there are several strong clues. The Celts treated 3 as a powerful number, and many early societies divided the year into 3 big phases, not 4 modern seasons, but a simpler rhythm: spring, summer, and winter. A fertility goddess tied to the turning year could easily become a triple presence. We also find the 3 goddess pattern in many other cultures: groups of fates, guardians, and supernatural women who shape life, birth, and destiny. That matters, because the mothers were sometimes associated with destiny figures in Roman thought, protectors who oversee the course of human life. What makes the mothers especially important is that they didn't remain locked into one role. At the core, they are fertility and prosperity goddesses, the kind that would have risen in an early farming world where women were central to cultivation, household survival, and the transmission of craft. But as societies grew, their job description expanded. In inscriptions, the mothers appear as protectors of homes, families, towns, tribes, and even whole peoples. Some are household mothers, watching over the home like sacred guardians. Others are named after regions or tribes, meaning they protected a specific community. Others are tied to groves and sacred woodland. You also see them connected directly to fields, where they keep crops healthy and bring plenty. And they are often invoked to protect women, especially during childbirth, which is exactly what you would expect from mother goddesses. In other words, mothers became almost a universal title. It could apply to many different female divinities because so many local goddesses were ultimately understood as descendants of the ancient Earth Mother idea. And here's the part that makes this feel alive even today. Folk memory kept them going long after official worship faded. In later stories across Europe, travellers meet 3 good ladies or white ladies in forests and lonely places. In fairy tales, 3 mysterious women appear at a child's birth to bless or shape its future, almost like a shadow of the old mothers. Sometimes the image flips and they become frightening hags, but the structure remains. 3 supernatural women tied to destiny, fertility, and the boundary between worlds. You can also see echoes of the mothers in later legendary figures and local spirits. Helpful beings who bring household prosperity, spirits of rocks and rivers, or women of the other world who control abundance and fruitfulness. In Britain, the cult of the mothers existed clearly in the Roman period, and Welsh tradition even preserved a name for fairies that literally means the mothers. That's the kind of linguistic fossil that suggests an old religious layer survived inside later folklore. In an even more striking twist, some old mother images were absorbed into Christian life. In certain places, ancient statues of mother figures holding a child were later treated as sacred images of Mary, especially when the wood had darkened with age, creating the tradition of black virgins. Many churches built on miraculous discovery stories may actually stand on older sacred ground where a pagan mother figure once received offerings. In at least one case, an altar once dedicated to the mothers became associated with the Virgin as the Good Mother. That is how deeply the old symbols of fertility and protection could embed themselves into the next religious world. Alongside the mothers, inscriptions also mentioned similar groups under different names. Matronae, Sulevii, household protectors, guardian women of crossroads. Some of these are likely just regional labels for the same basic idea. Female, protective powers tied to place, family, and life cycles. Crossroads goddesses, for example, fit perfectly into an old world where boundaries were spiritually charged, where travel, trade, and fate all seemed to meet at the same points. And when you step back, the bigger picture becomes clear. Celtic religion, especially in Gaul, wasn't a tidy set of 5 gods like Caesar listed. It was an enormous landscape of local powers, hundreds of named deities, many known only in one valley or one town, others spreading far. Some Roman gods arrived and were adopted as new sacred figures. Some native gods were renamed under Roman labels. Others kept their old names completely. What looks like one pantheon from a distance is really a mosaic. At the heart of that mosaic you can still see the oldest layers: farming rituals, sacred fertility, the priority of goddesses, spirits of rivers and woods, animal-shaped divine forces. Then you see the later layers: gods of healing springs, of trade and roads, of war, of the hunt, of culture and skill, and of the underworld. In times of conflict, war gods rose in importance. In times of stability and growing commerce, gods of travel, craft, and prosperity gained ground. Meanwhile, rural communities often kept older practices alive far longer than cities did. Now, let's step into Ireland's great myth world. A world built like 3 massive story universes that sometimes overlap, sometimes clash, and sometimes quietly share the same gods. Irish tradition preserves 3 major story streams. One revolves around the Tuatha de Danan, the shining otherworld beings who feel most like gods. The second follows Cu Chulin, the explosive hero of Ulster. The third belongs to Fion and the Fiana, the roaming warrior band that later became the heartbeat of popular legend. These 3 worlds are different in mood and focus, but they aren't sealed off. The divine figures from the Tuatha de Danan often step into the later hero stories, helping, guiding, or testing the human champions in the same way the gods intervene in Greek or Indian epics. What's interesting is how unevenly these stories survived in different places. In Wales, echoes of the old divine world remained. In the Scottish Highlands, stories of Cu Chulin and Fion stayed alive in oral tradition. But the Tuatha de Danan faded more than they once had. By the 16th century, church leaders were already complaining that Highlanders were still obsessed with wild stories about these old beings, a sign that Christian culture was pushing against a myth world that refused to die. And that brings us to a major shift. Christianity didn't simply erase the old gods. It relabeled them. Sometimes they were described as demons or goblins, just as earlier religions in other parts of the world had described older local gods as dark spirits. But at the same time, Christian scribes did something even more powerful. They turned myth into history. They transformed divine beings into ancient kings and made supernatural conflicts sound like tribal wars. This wasn't an entirely artificial trick. Many cultures already had myths claiming that rulers descended from gods. Gauls said they came from an underworld father. The Inca emperors claimed divine ancestry. Japanese imperial tradition did the same. So when Christian chroniclers tried to reshape Irish myth into a royal timeline, they were building on a universal habit, turning sacred origin stories into family trees. That's why Ireland ends up with multiple first settlement tales, dramatic, strange, and often contradictory. One story says Ireland was first reached by Banba and companions, but they died quickly. Another says fishermen discovered the island, left to bring back their wives, and were swallowed by a flood. The most famous version introduces Cessair, a granddaughter of Noah, arriving with a small group of men and 50 women, only for the flood to wipe almost everyone out. In that tale, a single survivor, Fintain, lives for centuries so the story can be remembered. Then comes another wave, the people of Partholon. They grow in number, build up the land, and then a plague destroys them. Again, one survivor is invented, Tuan, who undergoes strange transformations and later tells the story to a Christian saint. These one survivor characters aren't random, they function like narrative devices. They exist to answer one awkward question. If everyone died, who told the story? Even later, writers noticed the problem. Some suggested supernatural informants revealed the ancient past, or that the history was somehow carved into stone. These are all attempts to patch myth into chronicle. Then, the tone shifts darker. Enter the Fomorians, a shadowy force described as monstrous, distorted, and hostile. Some tales portray them with bizarre bodies. One-legged, one-armed, footless leaders, unnatural warriors. In later, history-style writing, they are explained as cursed descendants of biblical figures, but that is almost certainly a Christian overlay. Underneath, they look like something older, Aboriginal powers, or personified forces of chaos, winter, blight, and danger. In one major storyline, the Fomorians impose a brutal seasonal tribute. The payment is demanded on the eve of Samhain, the turning point into winter, and it includes not only food and livestock, but even children. That detail is horrifying in later moral terms, but in myth logic it points to a deeper theme. At the beginning of winter, the dark powers are rising, and something must be surrendered. It reads like a distorted memory of sacrifice, or of the fear that winter takes what summer gives. From the chaos of these early arrivals, another group appears, the Firbolg, men of bags, linked in later stories to slavery and humiliation abroad, then escape and return. They are often treated dismissively in the narrative, and they become enemies in hero tales. That contempt may be a signal that they represent the older pre-Celtic population of Ireland, turned into a legendary previous people, while the Fomorians become their associated divine powers. Then the myth world opens and the bright figures arrive, the Tuatha de Danan. In some versions, they descend from the sky, a clear sign of their divine status. In other versions, they come from the north, wrapped in a magical mist. Either way, their arrival is timed to Beltane, the start of summer. That timing matters. Beltane marks growth, warmth, fertility, and the return of light. Their conflict with darker forces is not just tribal warfare, it looks like nature symbolism turned into battle narrative. They fight on the plain of Magtuiad, and whether the tradition remembers one battle or two, the structure stays similar. The Tuatha de Danan struggle against Firbolg and Fomorians, win at terrible cost, and reshape the cosmic order. One of the most dramatic moments is the wounding of their leader, Nuada, who loses a hand. In this myth logic, a king cannot rule if physically blemished, so Nuada is replaced. And the crown goes to Bress, a figure with mixed lineage, part Tuatha de Danan, part Fomorian. That marriage connection is important. Even though these groups are enemies, they intermarry, just as rival tribes sometimes do in human politics. Myth is inconsistent on the details, but the pattern is clear. Conflict and union exist together. That's often a sign that these aren't human tribes at all, but symbolic families of powers. Bress grows fast, like many supernatural children in myth. He is also described as greedy and oppressive. Under his rule, the Tuatha de Danan, strangely, fall into a kind of tribute payment relationship with the Fomorians. On the surface, that seems impossible. Why would the bright gods ever be subject? But myth across the world does this all the time. Gods of life and light are often captured, sent down, or forced under for a season, like Persephone, Osiris, Adonis, and others. The story is hinting at a cycle. Power rises, power falls, and then returns. Eventually, Bress is publicly shamed through satire. a weapon with real magical force in Irish tradition. And from that moment, the story says decay clings to him. Nuada, restored, demands the throne back. Brez runs to raise the Fomorians, and the final clash becomes unavoidable. The battle erupts again at Samhain, the doorway into winter, matching the idea that the struggle between bright order and dark pressure peaks at the seasonal turning. In the fighting, great names collide. Ogma is wounded, Nuada is killed by Baela, and then Baela is struck down by Lugh, the shining champion who often represents mastery, skill, and victorious force. With Baela's fall, the Fomorians break and flee back to their own realm. After the battles of Mag Tuired, the Tuatha de Danan remain the dominant power in Ireland until a new wave arrives, the Milesians, named after a legendary ancestor, Mael, son of Bile. First comes a scout, Eith, sent to look over the island. He is killed, and that murder becomes the spark. The Milesians don't come to negotiate politely. They arrive in force. Even when the Druids raise a thick magical mist to block them, the invaders still reach shore. They confront the three rulers connected to Eth's death and demand an immediate outcome: battle or surrender. But instead of rushing into war, the dispute is handed to the Milesian poet, Emergen, whose voice carries the authority of law, ritual, and destiny. His decision is strange and symbolic. The Milesians must reboard their ships and pull back 9 waves from the coast. If they can land again after that, Ireland is theirs. It's a challenge that isn't just military, it's spiritual. The Tuatha de Danan answer with a supernatural storm. Ships break, men drown, the sea becomes a weapon. And then, Emergen fights back with words, reciting verses that feel less like ordinary poetry and more like fragments of an older ritual chant. The kind of spoken power meant to calm chaos and force the world back into order. The danger passes. The Milesians land. The Tuatha de Danan are defeated. But the ending isn't a clean "they're gone." In the older imagination, divine beings don't simply die. They change location. They change visibility. So the Tuatha de Danan retreat into the hollow hills, the hidden places of the land, and transform into what later generations call the Dawine Sea, the fairy people. The Milesians, often equated with the Goidels or early Scots, become the ancestors of the Irish in the story's historical framing. If the whole Conquest narrative feels repetitive at times, that's because it is. The same motifs keep reappearing. Mist, storms, floods, lone survivors, destroyed settlers, returns from abroad, tribute demands, final battles. These are not random coincidences. They are what happens when multiple versions of older myths, half-remembered rituals, and local traditions get stitched together into one long national timeline. The chroniclers who shaped these stories were trying to create a continuous historical flow, even when the raw material was mythic and contradictory. In their hands, the gods are slowly drained of open divinity and rewritten as kings, tribes, and conquerors, but the supernatural never fully disappears. It keeps leaking through the cracks. That's also why the Fomorians get reinterpreted so many different ways. Later, history-style readings describe them as sea demons, or pirates, and people try to explain their name by linking it to the word for sea. Others pictured them as beings from under the sea, or even from below in a subterranean sense. Some connected them with memories of Norse raiders, sea-born enemies whose brutality could easily fuse with older images of monstrous outsiders. But there's a stronger underlying possibility. The Fomorians were originally local pre-Celtic gods, tied to the land and its harsh powers, who became demonized after conquest. That fits the stories in a revealing way. Take King Bress, for example. When he tries to save himself after defeat, what does he offer? Not gold or territory, but promises tied to agriculture. Cattle always giving milk, harvests coming regularly, and the lucky days for ploughing, sowing, and reaping. That kind of knowledge belongs to a land power, not a random villain. It suggests the Fomorians were once understood as guardians of fertility, who could also become destroyers when offended. In farming societies, the same force that grows crops can also ruin them. The myth keeps that double edge. The Fomorians blight corn, milk, and fruit, yet people still bargain with them, paying fair tribute so they will not devastate the land. The tribute demanded at Samhain makes sense in that light. Winter is when communities fear loss, scarcity, and decay, and the myth gives those fears a face. This also helps explain why the Fomorians are said to exist in Ireland before many of the human settlers even arrive. In myth logic, that means they belong to the oldest layer of the island, the gods of the earlier people, later treated with contempt as slaves or defeated tribes in the story's humanized version. Another possibility is that they were the local gods of one group opposed to another because Celtic religion was often territorial and tribal. But either way, the conflict reads like a clash between competing sacred powers rooted in different communities and landscapes. The war between Fomorians and Tuatha de Danan also fits a wider pattern seen in many nature-based myth systems. Bright forces struggle against hostile forces. The sun fights storm and cloud. Vegetation dies and returns. Summer yields to winter and then rises again. Myths compress that repeating seasonal rhythm into a single epic war. Gods are wounded, slain, and yet return, because they represent cycles that never truly end. Ritual likely mirrored this struggle, because people believed their ceremonies could strengthen the good powers and weaken the hostile ones. That's why the intermarriage between enemy groups isn't as strange as it first appears. Myth mirrors human life. Rival peoples raid, capture spouses, make alliances, break them, and intermix over generations. The gods are imagined like tribes, hostile yet entangled. Later chroniclers amplify the contradictions, but the basic logic is deeply human. Within the Fomorian lineup, different figures embody different kinds of threat. Bela is the most famous, the giant with the deadly eye, a symbol of destructive gaze and cursed power. His eye becomes lethal through contact with poisonous magic, and when it opens, it kills. That image matches a fear deeply rooted across Celtic communities. The fear of the evil eye. Bela is like a walking catastrophe, and the myth's solution is telling. Loch, a beneficent divine champion, destroys Bela by striking the eye directly. Protective power defeats destructive power. Charm defeats curse. Light overcomes blight. Other Fomorians are less purely monstrous and more complex. Elatha, whose name suggests knowledge, looks like an older culture figure rather than a simple villain. Genealogies even mix Fomorians and Tuatha de Danan so thoroughly that the border between enemy race and divine family becomes blurry, another sign that these were divine powers before they were treated as human tribes. Meanwhile, the Tuatha de Danan remain unmistakably more than human, even after the chroniclers flattened them into rulers and warriors. They come from distant mystical learning, and they arrive carrying 4 signature treasures: a stone that recognizes rightful kingship, a spear that cannot be defeated, a sword that cannot be resisted, and a cauldron that never runs dry. These are not political objects. They are symbols of divine legitimacy, victory, and endless abundance. Even Christian-era storytelling accidentally admits their immortality. There's a moment where St. Patrick questions why a woman of the Tuatha de Danan, looks young while a mortal hero looks old? The answer is blunt. She belongs to the unfading kind. He belongs to the perishable kind. That one exchange punches through the "they were just ancient kings" disguise and reminds you what the Tuatha de Danan really are in the older worldview. After Ireland becomes Christian, people don't imagine the old gods vanishing. They imagine them withdrawing, still alive in hidden hills, still dwelling in far islands, still watching, sometimes helping, sometimes harming. Over time, the religious victory of Christianity gets retold as a racial conquest. Milesians defeat the Tuatha de Danan. But beneath that story is a quieter truth. The new faith replaced the old gods, not a new people physically erasing an old people. The gods became the cedar, the fairy folk, still powerful, still beautiful, still mysterious, still linked to the land. And that's why the myth world of the Tuatha de Danan feels different from the later hero cycles. The Cu Chulin and Fion stories are magical, yes, but they are grounded in conflict, flesh, time, and mortality. The Tuatha de Danan stories glow differently. They feel like a window into a brighter, stranger layer of reality, where divine food never runs out, beauty does not fade, death is not final, and the real battle is not just for territory, but for the hidden life of the world itself. For a long time, people explained the name Tuatha de Danan in a very clever, but probably wrong, way. They said it meant something like the wise science men who were gods, because they linked the ending to an Irish word for knowledge. But the older and more convincing meaning is simpler. It points to a people who belong to a goddess, not to a school of learning. In other words, it's best understood as the tribes of the goddess Danu. That also matches other old labels that describe them as the people, or the men of a goddess. Even though Danu is sometimes described as having only 3 famous sons, Brian, Uchar, and Ucharbar, the wider group still takes its identity from her. And that is why you sometimes see them nicknamed the Men of the 3 Gods. If you look across the Irish Sea into Welsh tradition, you find close cousins, Don and her children reflecting the same kind of divine family idea in a different Celtic setting. What's fascinating is how their identity shifts depending on who is telling the story. In some traditions, they look like kings and warriors, almost human rulers written into a timeline. In other traditions, especially the big heroic stories, they become openly supernatural, sometimes protectors, sometimes dangerous troublemakers, sometimes even treated like demons. Over time, one explanation became especially popular: the belief that they were tied to the hills and mounds, the ancient burial places scattered across the landscape. Some mounds even carried their names, and many different legendary figures were also connected to these places. Enemies, like the Fomorians, heroic leaders, and famous dead who were said to rest inside. One set of stories says that after they were defeated, these mounds were divided among them like territories, though different versions disagree on who did the dividing and when. In some tellings, they are immortal and continue living under the hills. In others, later writers pull them down to earth, giving them death dates and reign lengths like ordinary monarchs. That swing between divine immortals and human rulers comes from a process where old gods are gradually recast as historical figures, even while the older, stranger aura never fully disappears. So why do the mounds matter so much? One reason is that once a people starts treating certain beings as fairy-like, the next step is to place them in the most haunted, symbol-heavy locations imaginable. The ancient tumuli, the threshold between the living world and the world beneath. Another reason is that older beliefs about spirits of place, underground dwellers, and sacred hills may have existed before these stories, took their later form, and the traditions eventually blended together. That's why you sometimes see the Tuatha de Danan spoken of as if they arrive at underground dwellings and meet other beings already there. Over time, the labels fuse. The people of the mound becomes a flexible category that can include gods, heroes, ancient kings, and strange women who appear from nowhere, fall in love with mortals, or vanish back into the earth. And it's not just folklore. Christian writers even preserve echoes of this older worldview. In some stories, holy men are mistaken for men of the mound, basically treating them as if they belonged to that hidden divine world. The mounds themselves are imagined not as grim graves, but as marvellous underground halls, rich, bright, and full of wonders. Basically, a local doorway into the same idea as the far-off Paradise Islands you see in other myths. At the centre of all this stands Danu, the mother figure whose name gives the group its identity. She's often compared to great Mother of the Gods, figures in other religions, because she functions less like a single character in one story, and more like a deep foundation layer of belief. Irish tradition also circles around another powerful name, Anu, linked with abundance and the nurturing of divine beings, and the two are sometimes treated as related or even overlapping. When you track what these names are doing, a pattern emerges. They point toward an Earth Mother idea, fertility, plenty, the ground that feeds everything, and the underground that receives the dead. In many religions, Earth and Under-Earth are basically two sides of the same sacred space. And that helps explain why gifts of civilization, craft, healing, inspiration, are so often said to come from beneath, from the hidden world of the gods. That same merging also explains why later legends can turn a once-giving power into a feared presence. When a new belief system takes over, yesterday's protectors can become tomorrow's, threatening others, still powerful, still present, but pushed into exile under the hills. From that divine world come figures who feel less like ordinary characters and more like forces with faces. Bridget is one of the brightest examples, a goddess of inspiration and skill, tied to poetry, healing, and craft, and also tied to fire and fertility. Her popularity is so strong that she survives into Christian Ireland as Saint Brigid, with practices that look very much like a transformed older cult, especially the famous sacred fire tradition. Alongside these culture powers stand craft gods, like Goibniu the smith, surrounded by the old fear and respect that many cultures give to metalworkers, and healing figures like Diensecht, whose stories revolve around miraculous restoration, bitter jealousy, and a healing well that can pull warriors back from the edge of death. And when the mood shifts to war, the mythology turns to terrifying female powers, often in threes, like Morrigan and her sister figures, who appear like battle omens, crows over the slain, voices that announce victory and doom. Their prominence isn't random. It mirrors a world where women could be imagined as warriors, and where older fertility powers could evolve into fearsome guardians of life and death on the battlefield. Some traditions hint that Dagda, as a power of growth and plenty, may have overlapped with an older, darker figure remembered under names like Sen or Crom Cruach, titles that sound like Head of the Mound, the Crooked One, or even the Bloody Head. Later writers claimed that Dagda had another name, and that at Tara there was once a saying urging people to keep an altar fire burning for him. We can't prove those details today, but they match the idea that Ireland once had a major fertility cult focused on a mound shrine, where people believed the land's future depended on what happened at that sacred spot. When the old verses describe Crom, the mood is brutal. He's pictured as a feared god wrapped in mist, and the people are shown pleading for milk and grain, the core of survival, by offering something terrible in return. The stories say the sacrifices happened around Samhain, the seasonal turning point when the harvest was in and the next year's fate felt uncertain. The ritual is described with intense physical reactions. People collapsing, beating themselves, weeping until they are exhausted. Whether those details are exaggerated or not, the theme is clear. This is the kind of worship built on a raw bargain. We give blood. We get fertility. And in the logic of ancient farming religion, that bargain makes sense. Blood poured on an idol, flesh potentially buried in the soil, offerings meant to feed the ground. These are patterns found in many old fertility systems. Even if later storytellers inflated the numbers, the memory still preserves the same message. This was about making the fields live again. A related shadow shows up in the figure, sometimes called Crom Dubh, Black Crom, linked to a summer festival in early August. In later folk stories, Crom is pushed into a new setting. Now, he's part of a tale where the old powers stop helping humans farm once people choose the Christian path. In one version, it's Crom who asks a question about the afterlife. In another, a great otherworld figure pushes him to ask it. Either way, the ending is the same. The helpers withdraw, and the land loses that supernatural support. That kind of story is basically a cultural memory written as drama. The old gods of growth become the fair folk, and they fade when the new faith arrives. And whether the key offering was made at Samhain or at a late summer festival, the purpose points forward. It's about the next crop, not the last one. If Dagda really belongs to this fertility world, a lot of other details suddenly click. His closest divine relationship is with Boand, the river goddess of the Boyne. Water and fertility tied together exactly as you'd expect in an agricultural religion. And the family tree built around him is enormous. Names like Oengus, Bodbediag, Bridget, sometimes Danu, sometimes Ogma, are drawn into his orbit. Later writers even try to give Dagda a clean ending, saying he dies long after the great battles, killed by venom from a hostile figure. But the older tone doesn't really treat him like a normal mortal who simply dies. It treats him like a heavy, overflowing force of nature who can be wounded, mocked, tricked, and still remain enormous. That's why some of the stories about Dagda lean into earthy comedy. He's given a giant meal as a kind of humiliation, eats so much he can barely move, and ends up looking ridiculous. He's also pulled into dangerous romances, most famously with Morrigan, a terrifying goddess tied to battle and fate, with a location remembered as the couple's bed. In other stories, he shows up as a cook for a high king. None of that reads like polished palace mythology. It reads like older folk myth, big, physical, sometimes awkward, because fertility gods often carry that too much life energy, where abundance can look funny, scary, or both. Then the spotlight shifts to Hoengus, the young, beautiful figure who sometimes seems to rise as Dagda's successor. He's called the Young Sun, and in one famous story he effectively takes Dagda's own otherworld mound home through a clever trick, almost like a mythic way of saying, the new cult replaces the old one. That kind of replacement happens all over the ancient world. A newer divine figure becomes dominant, then gets written into the older family as a son, so the transition feels natural. There are also stories where Dagda is forced into humiliation under an enemy ruler. And it's Oengus who shows him how to turn the situation around. Again, reinforcing the idea that Oengus is the rising power. People sometimes label Oengus as an Irish god of love, mostly because later stories surround him with romance motifs. Birds whispering love thoughts, beautiful lovers, dramatic pursuits. But it's safer to see that as a later costume rather than the core identity. The older signals point to something broader, a god of growth and renewal, sometimes absent during the dead season of nature, sometimes returning with spring and abundance. That would also explain why he isn't always front and centre in battle stories. Fertility powers don't always show up like war leaders. Sometimes they appear indirectly, as the reason food returns and the land prospers. A lot of the best-known Angus romances feel like classic fairy tale machinery. The mysterious maiden, the hidden identity, the only on one specific day condition, the transformation motif. In one story he wins a swan maiden bride, but only after mortals help unlock the secret. In another, Etain is transformed, sheltered in a glass flower-filled chamber, then blown away by magic, swallowed and reborn. Some scholars try to force these into sun and dawn symbolism, but the structure is so close to international folktale patterns that it's more honest to treat them as fairy tale frameworks attached to famous divine names. They're still valuable, not because they decode the weather, but because they show how myth evolves. Old gods become characters inside story templates people already love. Oengus also shows up later as a protector figure in hero legends, especially as the guardian of Diomed. And alongside other divine powers, he's described driving away destructive forces that ruin corn, fruit, and milk. Again, a very clear fertility defender role. Meanwhile, another mound king, Mida, moves through the same mythic landscape. Ruler of an underground palace, tied to a paradise-like Otherworld, involved in the Etain drama, and connected to cattle and magical treasures stolen from his realm. Echoes of the old idea that civilization's gifts come from the divine land. When you step back, the calendar itself seems to be part of the story. The tradition remembers victories and disasters clustered around seasonal markers, summer strength, winter decline, like a mythic reflection of what farmers feel every year. Growth rises, then it seems to die, then it returns. Later, writers recast that as battlefield history, where gods are slain like warriors. But underneath, you can still sense an older rhythm. That brings us to Nuada, the king who loses a hand and receives a silver replacement, becoming of the silver hand. Some scholars compare this to other Indo-European myths, where divine figures lose limbs and gain magical replacements. But the simplest explanation may be closer to ritual and kingship. In Ireland, a ruler is expected to be physically whole, so a mutilated king needs restoration. Myth provides it. It's also possible the story formed around an image or symbol. If a sacred figure was shown with an artificial hand, a narrative would naturally grow to explain it. Nuada's Welsh parallel, a silver-handed leader who frees his people from plagues, supports the idea that this is a life and growth kingship figure more than a sun god. From there, the camera pans to the sea. Lear, whose very name means sea, is mostly a background presence remembered through the famous tragedy of his children turned into swans. But his son becomes huge. Manannán mac Lir, son of the sea, is everywhere. In story after story, he rides across the waves in a chariot like the ocean is solid ground, vanishes and reappears at will, knows the weather, and rules the boundary between worlds. Waves themselves get poetic names tied to him, his horses, his wife's hair, because when you have a sea god with real cultural weight, even the sea's movements start to feel like his body in motion. And once a sea god is strong enough, he naturally becomes tied to the far-off paradise beyond the horizon. The Otherworld is no longer only under the hills, it's also over the sea, reachable by the right voyage, the right invitation, or the right magic. Manannán keeps showing up in Ireland's biggest hero stories, but he rarely feels like a simple character. He moves more like a force, an otherworld ruler who can step into human lives whenever he wants. In the tales around Cu Chulin, he's tied to Fand, the Otherworld woman who becomes the hero's lover. In the Fion traditions, he appears as the power behind fairyland training, with Diomed learning under his influence, and even kings like Cormac being drawn across the boundary as honoured guests. What matters is the pattern. Manannan isn't just a sea god who rules waves, he's also a gatekeeper of that parallel realm where time bends, food never runs out, and a mortal can return changed forever. Even after Ireland became Christian, the old belief didn't vanish. It simply wore new clothing. One famous legend places Manannan right inside a historical moment. A king is losing a desperate battle, and a mysterious stranger offers to save him if the king's wife will submit to him. She agrees, and the child born from that union is later remembered as King Mongan, so famous that a chronicler bluntly says everyone knew his real father was Manannan. That's how these stories work in a Christian world. The myth doesn't disappear, it adapts. The god becomes a hidden father, a secret explanation for unusual greatness. And at the same time, the legend hints at rebirth themes, because Mongan is also connected to the idea of Fion returning in another life. Manannan's memory stayed alive not only in stories but in place and practice. On the Isle of Man, people pointed to a grave linked to him. And until relatively late, midsummer customs survived where rushes were set out for him on hilltops, small gestures that feel like the echo of older offerings. And you can watch the same mythic energy slipping into Saint legends. Figures like Barintus, who guides Arthur to blessed islands, or Saint Barry, who is said to cross the sea on horseback, look suspiciously like Christianized reflections of a sea power who rides the waves. The details almost give the game away. Manannan's horse is described with a name that can mean sea foam, and he himself is called a rider of the wild sea. In other words, what sounds like a miracle story may also be an older sea god story, retold with a new label. When storytellers describe Manannan's gear, they give him the full toolkit of wonder. Armour that makes you untouchable, a weapon that terrifies anyone who sees it, a horse and a boat that ignore ordinary physics, pigs that return to life after being killed, a cloak that hides you, a cup that cracks into lie, and a cloth that produces food with a simple motion. These objects aren't uniquely Celtic, similar treasures appear all over world folklore. So it's safer not to force them into cloud equals armour, lightning equals sword type symbolism. The better takeaway is simpler. Manannan gathered an enormous web of stories around him, and what survives is only a fraction. The sheer volume of magic attached to his name is a sign that his mythology used to be much richer than what we can now recover. From Manannan, the story naturally pivots to another giant of the mythic world, Lugh. His family background changes depending on the version, but the strongest tradition makes him the son of Fion and Ethne, who is the daughter of Bela. Folk versions keep the storyline sharp and cinematic. Bela is a dangerous tyrant on Tory Island, warned that his grandson will kill him. To prevent that, he locks his daughter away. But the prophecy finds a path. A rival slips past the defences, Ethne gives birth, and Bela tries to erase the threat by casting the children into the sea. One survives, Lugh, rescued and raised in secret. When the time comes, Lugh fulfills the prophecy by destroying Bela, famously piercing Bela's single deadly eye with a burning weapon. In some versions, Manannan is the helper who makes the impossible access and escape possible, which fits his role as the master of crossings and hidden routes. Lugh's entrance into the main war narrative is portrayed like a spotlight switching on. In one telling, he arrives from the Otherworld as a radiant champion and the enemy collapses before him. In another, the story is more structured and almost like a tryout scene. Lugh appears at Tara offering services. Smith, warrior, poet, healer, craftsman, and each time the gatekeepers say, "We already have one." Then he delivers the key line. He isn't just one thing, he's the one who holds every art at once, the complete package. That's when the leadership changes hands, at least temporarily, because Lugh is framed as something bigger than any single specialist. He doesn't replace craft gods like Goibniu or Diensect. He stands above the entire category, like a supreme patron of skill itself. After that, he leads the host, sings a war chant, and the battle turns on his victory over Baelor. This, master of all arts, identity becomes even more interesting when you compare Ireland to the Celtic world beyond it. Across Gaul, a major god was often identified by Roman writers with Mercury, the figure described as the inventor and patron of arts and skills. That profile lines up closely with Lugh. Place names reinforce it too. Towns like Lugudunum carry his name, showing how wide the cult once spread. Some evidence even suggests multiple forms, Lugh not as a single isolated figure, but as a power that could appear in plural shapes, like the Lugovs. That wouldn't be unusual in Celtic religion, where certain divine figures multiply into triads or regional variants, just as Bridget appears in more than one form. When you zoom out, the Tuatha de Danan start to look less like a single neat pantheon and more like a layered system built over time. Ireland preserves them through story, while the continental Celtic world preserves many of its gods through inscriptions, different evidence, same underlying type of religion. The functions match: powers of growth and agriculture, light and plenty, war and protection, crafts and healing. And it's very likely that many big names we know today absorbed smaller local gods, pulling their titles and traits into a single famous profile. That would explain why the same figure can carry multiple names, and why you sometimes meet regional gods of Ulster or Connaught in the sources. The tradition is not tidy because real religion on the ground wasn't tidy. It was local, practical, and constantly blending. One of the most important threads running through all of this is the weight of divine women. Irish tradition repeatedly places goddesses at the centre. They give their names to groups, they drive major plot turns, they choose lovers, they offer gifts, they punish, they protect. Even war is heavily feminized in myth through terrifying battle queens. And this isn't a minor detail. It suggests an older stage of society and belief, where fertility, craft knowledge, and the foundations of culture were imagined as female powers first. Later, as male gods become more prominent, the old structure doesn't vanish, it stays visible underneath. That's why so many heroes are linked to their mothers' names, why women dominate key colonization legends, and why Otherworld women so often initiate love rather than passively receiving it. When we try to rebuild the old Welsh gods, we're not working with a clean rulebook. We're working with fragments, names, scenes, strange magical moments, preserved inside later stories. Wales doesn't hand us a neat pantheon list. Instead, it gives us a set of famous tales and poems where the old divine figures have been remodeled into kings, queens, heroes, and sorcerers. The biggest source is the Mabinogion. The surviving manuscripts are late, but the material inside them is older and often carries the scent of a much earlier world. Around it, other Welsh traditions, short triadic lists, praise poems, bardic pieces, keep flickers of myth alive, even when the language is cryptic and the style feels like a puzzle. And then, you have the Arthurian universe. It may hide older gods behind its glitter, but that terrain is risky because romance and invention swallow myth very easily. One big question shapes everything. Are these Welsh figures basically Irish gods in Welsh clothes? Or are they genuinely Brythonic? The most honest answer is that they look like a blend. Some Welsh stories cluster in regions that once had a strong goidalical presence, and that helps explain why a few names and ideas feel familiar if you know Irish tradition. But the match is never complete. Many Welsh characters have no Irish parallels. Many scenes are entirely local, and some shared motifs are the kind of travelling folklore that hops cultures without needing direct borrowing. You can actually watch that stitching happen in the way Welsh gods degrade into story people. They gain human biographies. They age, marry, get tricked, suffer humiliations, and sometimes die with a grave you can point to. They're treated like rulers and nobles, or like the eerie, fair folk, rather than openly worshipped gods. That's the same drift we see in Ireland. Old divinities pushed underground, turned into legendary royalty, then into the supernatural neighbours living just beyond the visible world. A great example is the Lear family, which unfolds across two major story arcs: the tragedy of Branwen and the survival tale of Manawydan. In the Branwen story, Wales and Ireland become locked in a catastrophic chain reaction. An insult at court leads to a marriage gone wrong, humiliation turns into war, and a magic cauldron that can restore the dead turns the battlefield into something nightmarish. The war ends only when the cauldron is destroyed at the cost of a hero's life, and when the giant king Bran is mortally wounded. Even after death, Bran still doesn't leave the story. His severed head is carried home, and for years it keeps his companions in a dreamlike state of feasting and joy, until a taboo is broken and the spell collapses. Then the head is buried in London, not as a horror object, but as a protective relic, a spiritual barrier against invasion. Right there, you can feel older myth behind the later storytelling. A head that prevents disaster, time that passes like a dream, a forbidden door that must never be opened. These are classic Otherworld signals. And Bran himself is not built like an ordinary king. He's too large for ships. He wades the sea. He's mistaken for a mountain as he approaches. That kind of impossible body often marks a figure who used to be divine. Later, Christian tradition even tries to claim him as a missionary saint, which is a common afterlife for pagan heroes whose names and titles remain too strong to erase. The next part of the Lear arc follows Manawydan, a figure who feels quieter than Ireland's thunderous Manannan, but still carries the same silhouette. The wise, otherworld-linked man who solves problems with mind rather than brute magic. In the story, Manawydan marries Rhiannon and enters a land that suddenly becomes barren by enchantment. He tries trades to survive, becomes a master craftsman, but jealousy drives him out again and again. The turning point comes when he walks into a strange castle, where people vanish, and he finally confronts the magician responsible. The resolution isn't big spell versus big spell. It's strategy, patience, and clever leverage. Another hint that Manawydan belongs to that older class of divine figures who bring civilization skills into the human world. Behind Lear himself, you can sense an older sea divinity. The name aligns with the Irish Lear, and later traditions multiply Lear into more than one figure, showing how easily myth duplicates itself in different regions. Some sources confuse Lear with other famous names, which might reflect old overlaps, or might simply be later scribal chaos. But the most grounded reading is still that Lear sits closest to the sea, a foundational water power whose children become major movers of the mythic world. Branwen, White Bosom, sits at the crossroads of sea and fertility imagery. Some interpret her as a sea goddess, others see her closer to the cauldron motif, which often signals regeneration, abundance, and the raw, old ritual logic of life returning from death. Later, romance recycles her into the love potion world of Tristan and Isolde under a similar sounding name, another example of how mythic residue gets repurposed into medieval storytelling. Then the camera shifts to a different divine cluster, the Children of Dawn, the Welsh counterpart to the Irish Goddess Mother pattern. This group includes figures like Gwydion, Arianrhod, Gavanon, Amathon, and the younger hero Lugh. The names don't match Ireland one-to-one, but the functions feel familiar: culture, craft, agriculture, magic, fate. The main showcase here is the math story, which plays like a high drama fantasy. Court scandal, magical deception, punishment through shape-shifting, a child born under taboo conditions, a hero given a name through trickery, and a wife literally made from flowers, only for betrayal to explode the whole system. Math appears as the ancient lord of a region and the top authority in magic. He's portrayed as a ruler, but he also feels like a presiding power of order, protective toward the suffering, severe toward wrongdoing, yet not mindlessly vengeful. Whether that comes from an old god profile or an idealized king model, the effect is the same. He carries the weight of an older sacred judge. Gwydion is the most obvious candidate for a culture god. He's a master of transformation, illusion, battle magic, and creation. He can conjure fleets, reshape living forms, and even help build a human out of flowers. But beneath the wizard image, you can see an older identity. The divine patron of poets, seers, and inspired speech. The tradition repeatedly frames him as the mind behind enchantment and prophecy, the kind of figure who would have mattered deeply in a society where poets and diviners were cultural engineers. And he's also tied to the raid into the Otherworld motif, the theft of supernatural animals from NWFN, the divine land. That theme appears across Celtic tradition because it encodes a belief that the tools of civilization, animals, crafts, abundance, ultimately come from the god's realm. Amathon feels even more transparent. His name is linked to labour and ploughing, and he's remembered as the one who can make difficult land workable. That's not just a guy who farms. That's myth language for a fertility or agriculture power. And in other references, he's connected to taking animals from NWFN, the same cultural gift logic again, but reshaped into a story of conflict. Lugh is trickier. The surviving story focuses on the fairy tale skeleton, the treacherous wife, the secret weakness, the ambush, the miraculous survival, the restoration and the punishment. That structure is so international that it's dangerous to force it into a strict sun and dawn allegory. Still, some mythic residue pokes through. Lugh doesn't simply die, he becomes an eagle-like creature and later returns. That unusual survival path may preserve a much older layer where the god's essence was linked to a bird form, or where death meant transformation, not ending. Arianrhod carries the classic divine contradiction. She claims virgin purity, yet she's clearly part of a fertility-driven myth system, producing powerful sons and acting as a gatekeeper who tries to deny them identity and status. That mix, virgin and mother, distant and generative, fits a pattern seen across many ancient religions. She's also later associated with celestial imagery, suggesting that when direct cult memory faded, people anchored her in the sky. Her son Dylan is one of the clearest "this used to be a god" cases. The story says he rushes into the sea and becomes one with its nature. Waves don't break under him. The sea is his element. The coastline mourns his death with a sound that becomes his dying groan. That's not just poetic writing. It's myth trying to explain why the sea behaves like a living being. Dylan reads like a local sea god who later gets folded into a family drama and killed by a Smith uncle figure, leaving only the sea's endless lament as evidence of his presence. Finally, there's the dye-faired set, Pwyll, Rhiannon, and Pryderi. Their story looks more like romance on the surface. An otherworld exchange, a fairy bride, a stolen child, false accusation, restoration, but underneath it's still driven by divine geography. Pwyll becomes head of Anna WFAN, which is basically a badge that says, this isn't merely a human prince, this is a figure with authority in the otherworld. Rhiannon's name points to Great Queen, the kind of title that often belongs to sovereignty and fertility goddesses. Pryderi becomes the inheritor of this strange divine social world, tied to otherworld animals like swine and to the idea that wealth and livestock ultimately come from beyond. One important family in Welsh tradition is that of Beli and his sons. In early tales, especially those surrounding Branwen and the Dream of Maxen, Beli appears as a powerful ancestral figure whose sons include Lud, Caswallon, Ninio, and Levelis. Over time, storytellers and chroniclers reshaped him. In later accounts, he becomes linked with Belinus. And behind both names, many scholars see the shadow of the older Celtic god Belinos, not a dark or sinister being, but a radiant protector figure, associated with victory and the defence of the Honey Island, Britain itself. The stories remember him as a champion who preserves the stability of his realm. Even when the myths shift and merge, that image of strength and guardianship remains. Caswallon, one of Beli's sons, eventually blends with the historical Cassivellornis, the British leader who resisted Julius Caesar. Yet older traces suggest he may once have been more than a warrior king. In certain traditions he carries the title War King, and this may hint at a divine origin, perhaps a god of battle believed to invisibly guide armies. His brother Ninio appears in later retellings under the name Nennius, while Lud becomes central in a dramatic legend about saving his land from 3 terrible plagues. In that story, Lud defeats mysterious beings who can hear every whisper, imprisons battling dragons beneath Dinas Emrys, and captures a magician who steals food from the people. These parts may preserve echoes of older fertility myths, stories about protecting the land from forces that threaten growth, harvest, and stability. Lud is also remembered as a generous ruler and a rebuilder of cities, linked to early London through the name Ludgate. That suggests he may once have been worshipped there. Closely related is Nud, known from inscriptions as Nodens. His son Gwyn ap Nud becomes especially important in legend. Gwyn is described as a warrior, a hunter and the hope of armies. But he is also ruler of An Wfn, the Otherworld. In later Christian stories, saints confront him as a fairy king whose shining court vanishes when sprinkled with holy water. That tension between pagan wonder and Christian rejection reveals something important. Gwyn was likely the focus of real cult devotion. Over time, he shifts from fertility god and warrior to fairy king and even a shadowy figure connected with the souls of the dead. Another powerful strand of myth surrounds a Taliesin. Later tradition blends the historical 6th century poet with something much older, a mythic being tied to inspiration itself. In the famous story, the goddess Ceridwen prepares a magical cauldron that grants wisdom. By accident, the boy Gwion gains its power, flees, transforms through many shapes, and is reborn as Taliesin. Beneath the poetic imagery lies an older pattern, the cauldron as a symbol of rebirth, inspiration, and fertility. Ceridwen herself may once have been a grain or fertility goddess, later adopted as a patron of poets. Taliesin, in turn, resembles a shamanic figure, one who passes through many forms, enters the spirit world, and returns transformed. His story connects inspiration, rebirth, and the theft of sacred knowledge from the divine realm. When we move into the Arthurian world, things become even more complex. Some figures who appear beside Arthur, such as Mabon, Kay, and others, likely preserve traces of earlier gods. Marbon, whose name simply means the youth, may be linked to the god Maponos, known from inscriptions in Britain and Gaul and associated with healing. Kay, in early Welsh material, possesses almost supernatural endurance and fiery battle energy, traits strikingly similar to Irish heroic battle fury traditions. These are not simply knights of romance, they are echoes of divine archetypes. Arthur himself is a layered figure. In early sources he appears as a war leader. In others, he hunts magical beasts, steals cauldrons from the Otherworld, and disappears to a mystical island to be healed, never fully dying. This pattern matches older Celtic hero myths, the miraculous child, the culture hero who brings gifts from beyond, and the king who will return. Whether Arthur began as a local god, a heroic ideal, or a historical commander whose memory absorbed mythic elements, his legend eventually overshadowed nearly all other British divine figures. Merlin, too, shifts shape. Sometimes prophet, sometimes magician, sometimes born of mysterious supernatural origin, he represents the archetype of sacred knowledge and transformation. Attempts to interpret him as a sun god or cosmic deity stretch beyond what the evidence supports. More likely, he reflects the image of a powerful seer or divine magician whose story accumulated layers over centuries. Stepping back, we can see a clear pattern. The gods and heroes of the Britons resemble those of Ireland and Gaul. They are linked to fertility, war, healing, the sea, inspiration, and the Otherworld. Many were later reimagined as kings, warriors, magicians, or fairy rulers. Their divine status faded into legend, but their functions remained visible beneath the surface. Archaeology supports this picture. Inscriptions across Britain mention gods whose names connect to these figures. Nodens appears in stone carvings. Belenos echoes in Belinus or Beli. Maponos matches Mabon. Taranos, a thunder god known on the continent, may survive in Welsh tradition. Classical writers record British deities like Andrasta, invoked by Boudica before battle, and Sul, the healing goddess of Bath. Others, Camelos, Belatucadros, Cosidius, were equated with Mars. Granos and other healing gods were associated with Apollo. Many of these were local, worshipped in specific regions or by specific tribes. Some spread more widely, perhaps carried by soldiers or trade. When people talk about the Cu Chulin stories, they often say the action belongs to the very start of the Christian era, even claiming that King Conchobar's death lines up with the crucifixion. But the world you meet in these tales is not a reliable historical timeline. Yes, a few names overlap with old records, yet most of the characters live in a space where legend is stronger than fact. What you're really watching is a myth-shaped version of pagan Celtic ideals, later retouched by Christian storytellers and also influenced by famous adventure traditions from elsewhere, including classical narratives and northern saga-style storytelling. The version we know today didn't appear all at once. Over time, the story world expanded like a long-running series. New parts kept getting added, and some of the longer narratives feel like several older, once independent adventures stitched together into one bigger arc. The heart of it all is Cu Chulin, and the main storyline that everything keeps circling back to is the famous cattle raid, known as the Cattle Spoil of Cooley. Around Cu Chulin stands a full cast of major players: Conchobar and Dectyre, Ailil and Medb, Fergus, Conall Cernac, Cu Roi, Deirdre and the Sons of Usnach. The interesting thing is that the saga doesn't treat them as ordinary humans. Some are said to descend from gods. Some look like ancient deities who have been humanized into kings and warriors. Conchobar is even described as a kind of earthly god, and Dectyre is spoken of in divine terms. The origin stories set the tone immediately. Conchobar's birth is told in more than one way, and in at least one version he is linked directly to the god Lugh. During Conchobar's reign, Cu Chulin is born, and even his fatherhood is deliberately unclear. Sometimes he is the son of a mortal man, sometimes connected to Conchobar himself, and sometimes presented as the child, or even the reborn form of Lugh. This uncertainty is not a mistake, it is myth logic. Heroes in this tradition often carry a double identity. Part human, part Otherworld. From the start, Cu Chulin is built as a superhero before superheroes existed. As a boy, he arrives at Conchobar's court and defeats the king's elite youth fighters, then ends up leading them. Soon after, he kills the fierce guard dog of Chulin the smith, and to settle the damage he offers to take the dog's place until a new one can be raised. That's when he receives the name Chulin's Hound, Cu Chulin. Then comes one of the most dramatic signature moments. He takes the king's weapons and chariot while still incredibly young, defeats powerful champions, and returns home in the terrifying condition known as his battle fury. He becomes so dangerously overheated with rage that the story says he must be cooled in vats of water until the frenzy breaks. As he grows, the saga pushes his image to the absolute maximum. Unmatched strength, skill, intelligence, and beauty. The tale even frames him as so desirable that the leaders of Ulster try to find him a wife simply to prevent chaos from the attention he attracts. His choice is Emma, and their courtship is presented like a coded conversation. A strange, private language only she understands. Emma agrees, but under harsh conditions, and her father Forgol tries to sabotage the match by sending Cu Chulin away for advanced warrior training, hoping he will never return. This is where the story shifts into a training arc that feels almost cinematic. Cu Chulin travels to Alba, refuses the love of a local princess who swears revenge, and then reaches Scathach, the legendary warrior woman who trains champions. The journey itself is framed as a gauntlet of impossible obstacles, including a narrow swinging bridge and a deadly surrounding gulf. Under Scathach, he becomes the greatest fighter alive. He also fights Scathach's rival Aefe, defeats her, and fathers a son with her, Conla. A tragic rule is placed on the boy. When he later goes searching for his father, he must not reveal his name. The result is one of the saga's most brutal twists. Father and son meet as strangers, fight in single combat, and only after the killing blow does Cu Chulin recognize the ring that proves the boy's identity. The shock and grief land with full force because the tragedy is built into the rules from the beginning. When Cu Chulin returns, he tears down Forgol's stronghold, kills many inside it, and takes Amer. After that, the saga presents him as Ulster's ultimate defender across many separate adventures. And one of the most important background elements is the strange curse known as the weakness of the Ulsterman. In this story, a woman named Marcha is forced, while pregnant, to race against the king's horses. She wins, but collapses into labour and in pain and fury curses the men of Ulster. Whenever the province faces extreme danger, they will be struck by a crippling weakness, like the pains of childbirth. Cu Chulin alone is exempt, because he is framed as not truly of Ulster, but tied to Lugh. Whether this curse reflects an old ritual idea, a taboo season, or a myth invented to explain a custom, the saga uses it as a plot switch. When disaster hits, Ulster cannot defend itself, so one man must stand alone. That is exactly what happens in the cattle raid of Cooley. Medb Queen of Connaught, once linked to Conchobar in tradition, now stands as Ulster's enemy. Her husband Ailill possesses a magnificent bull, and Medb refuses to be outshone. She demands an equal beast, the brown bull of Cooley. When she is denied, she gathers an enormous army and marches on Ulster, at the perfect moment. The Ulster warriors are incapacitated by Marcha's curse. So Cu Chulin becomes the shield of the province, forcing Medb into an agreement. Instead of a full battle, her champions must face him one by one in single combat. This structure turns the raid into a sequence of duels, each one raising the stakes until the most heartbreaking fight arrives. Cu Chulin must face Ferdia, his close companion bound to him by the deep loyalty of fosterage and blood brotherhood. The story lingers on his refusal, his emotional collapse, and then his devastation when Ferdia finally falls. In the end, Ulster's warriors recover and drive Medb back, but not before she succeeds in taking the bull. The finale is brutal and mythic. Medby's bull and Ailill's white-horned bullfight. The brown bull kills its rival, then stampedes home in madness and dies in a final, violent collapse. Threaded through the raid is the presence of the Morrigan, the dangerous goddess who shifts shape and brings war fate with her. She first approaches Cu Chulin as a beautiful woman offering love. He rejects her, and she becomes his enemy. She attacks him in animal forms, eel, wolf, heifer, and each time he wounds her. Because the wound cannot be truly healed except by the one who inflicted it, she returns disguised as an old woman milking a cow. He accepts milk from her, and with each drink he gives a blessing, and without realizing it, he heals the goddess he had harmed. Meanwhile, the saga makes the divine link explicit. Lu appears, naming himself Cu Chulin's father, and other Otherworld beings help by sending healing power into the waters where the hero washes his wounds. But the saga is not content with making him unbeatable. It also sets up the logic of his death long before it arrives. He kills a sorcerer named Calatin, and later Calatin's family returns like a delayed curse. Through deception, Cu Chulin is lured into breaking one of his sacred personal prohibitions, his gaze, by eating dog flesh, something he is forbidden to do. In this tradition, a gaze is not just a rule, it is a spiritual fault line. Once it breaks, the hero's protection cracks. Soon after, he is killed in battle by Lugaid. And here you can feel the hand of Christian editors. The hero's death is followed by a vision-like moment. His spirit appears to the many queens who loved him, and the scene is coloured with a prophecy tone about Christ and final judgment. Other versions go even further, showing Cu Chulin pleading for salvation or urging belief when he appears to later figures. Conchobar's death story is also retouched in the same way. He is said to be driven into fatal frenzy on hearing that the crucifixion has taken place. These details don't erase the pagan hero. They reframe him, almost tenderly, so that the old champion can exist in a new religious world. So what is Cu Chulin, really? In these stories, he is the perfect Celtic warrior, but also something larger than life, a figure inflated beyond the human scale. His child strength, his solo victories against impossible odds, his otherworld connections, his relationship with a goddess, even the tragic father kills son scenario. These are patterns found across the world's storytelling traditions. They gather around great names like magnets. That means you can't simply decode him by matching him to another hero like Heracles and assume you've explained everything. The similarities tell you more about how myth works than about who Cu Chulin was. For a long time, one group of scholars looked at Cu Chulin and said, "This has to be a son story." And once you choose that lens, everything starts getting forced into a solar shape. If the hero matures unusually early, that must be the sun developing fast. If his hair is described with multiple colours, that must be sunrise rays or the 3 divisions of the day. If his eyes are described in an exaggerated way, then someone claims it represents the days of the week. Even the idea that women go blind because they love him gets turned into, you can't stare at the sun. But when you step back, you can see the problem. These are not unique clues. Early maturity, dramatic hair, supernatural eyes, exaggerated reactions from onlookers. These are standard myth and hero storytelling tools that show up everywhere, even in stories that have nothing to do with the sun. The same stretching happens with his famous battle transformation. Some interpreters try to treat the hero's violent war frenzy with its heat, sparks, and terrifying distortion as a picture of dawn or sunset. But that doesn't really fit what the scene is doing. The frenzy is not a calm, cosmic cycle. It is a brutal, hypercharged warrior state, described in extreme language because that's how heroic epics talk about fighters. We even have parallels in other warrior cultures where intimidation techniques and performance in battle are deliberately exaggerated in storytelling. And there's another simple point. In Irish myth, Lugh can be linked to light, yet he does not display the same war frenzy distortion. So the distortion is better understood as the saga's way of turning rage into spectacle, not a coded astronomy lesson. Even the famous cooling scene, the hero plunged into vats until he stops boiling with heat, has been read as the sun sinking into water and rising again. But it can also be read in a far more grounded way. A dramatic upgrade of something real. A warrior comes back overheated and half mad with adrenaline. He's cooled down with water. The storyteller turns it into 3 vats that hiss and boil because that sounds epic. When you approach these details like a filmmaker instead of a decoder, the scenes suddenly make more sense. The saga is building a terrifying warrior image, not mapping the sky. The solar approach also tries to turn every journey into a symbolic trip to the Underworld, because the sun goes down in the west. So Scathach's island becomes Hades. But the saga's geography doesn't cooperate. Cu Chulin visits different places for different reasons, and not all of them feel like the land of the dead or the blessed. Some are simply enemy territory, training territory, or the place where the bride lives. Even the attempt to label Emma as a dawn maiden collapses once you check how the story actually works. The language used about her can be read in normal human terms: noble birth, hospitality, status, without needing to invent a cosmic marriage between dawn and sun. And the solar theory gets genuinely ridiculous when it tries to explain his multiple relationships by saying the sun god needs as many dawn lovers as there are days in the year. That's not interpretation anymore, that's a system trying to protect itself. So, if we drop the sun mask, what remains? A much clearer picture. Cu Chulin is the saga's ultimate warrior ideal. He is deliberately too much, too young, too strong, too fast, too frightening, too beautiful, too doomed. The exaggerated traits are not scientific symbols, they are narrative fuel. Some of his features are borrowed from international hero patterns that show up in many cultures, and some have a distinctly Celtic flavour, because the Irish material shapes those patterns with local beliefs, taboos, battle magic, and otherworld encounters. That doesn't mean there's nothing religious here. In fact, a more believable possibility is that Cu Chulin carries traces of a war god or a hero who absorbed divine features over time. He stands close to figures like the Bad and the Morrigan, and he moves through a world where supernatural women, battle fate, and divine intervention are normal. He also sometimes acts like a culture hero. He claims mastery not just in fighting, but in wisdom, law, politics, poetic skill, and sacred knowledge, and he is credited with bringing powerful things from beyond the human world. Add to that a wider Celtic habit of giving divine honours to heroic figures, living or dead, and you can easily imagine how a hero like this could slide into cult status or grow out of one. Some scholars have tried a different route. Instead of making him the sun, they compare him to famous twin hero patterns, like Castor and Pollux. The argument goes like this. Perhaps Cu Chulin and Conall Cernach were a Celtic version of the Dioscuri. There are tempting surface similarities, divine parentage for one, shared nursing traditions in some tellings, and ancient writers do mention twin worship among Celts near the ocean. But when you look closer, the theory becomes shaky. Cu Chulin doesn't match the immortal twin/mortal twin structure cleanly, and attempts to link specific carved figures on continental altars to Cu Chulin depend on clever wordplay and very thin evidence. It's the kind of idea that sounds powerful in summary, but gets weaker the more you test it. Another ambitious proposal tries to push parts of the Cu Chulin world back onto the continent. It points to carvings where a woodcutter god is shown cutting a tree, and elsewhere a bull appears with 3 birds, and argues that these images echo famous moments from the cattle raid, trees used as obstacles and the bull being warned by a goddess in bird form. From there, the theory attempts to identify the woodcutter deity with Cu Chulin himself by arguing that the god's name suggests speed, fury, and strength, qualities the hero clearly has. It even tries to connect tribal movements between Gaul, Britain, and Ireland to explain how a hero name could transform across regions. The problem is that these connections are mostly speculative. The relevant divine names don't appear in Irish tradition in the way the theory requires, and the continental god involved is linked to human sacrifice, which is not an obvious match for the literary hero, unless you argue that his extreme slaughter scenes are distant echoes of older rites. Where things get genuinely interesting is in the folk versions of the saga, the rougher, wilder tellings preserved in a popular tradition. In some of these, the cattle raid and the death of Cu Chulin are not separate storylines at all. They merge into one event, and the fighting over the bull becomes the moment where the hero dies. In one striking version, the bull is actually Cu Chulin's own, and a rival tries to steal it. The hero disguises himself, tricks the thief, and when the bull is finally seized, the struggle ends with the animal being torn apart. That kind of detail opens a different door. What if, in an older layer of myth, the bull and the hero were not separate? Across many cultures, powerful gods and spirits can appear in animal form, especially bulls, and later storytelling can upgrade the animal into a human hero while leaving the animal behind, as a symbol, a property, or a sacred object. If a hero's life is tied to the fate of a calf, or if a goddess shifts between helping the bull and opposing the hero in confusing ways, that may preserve a memory of an older myth where bull and champion were once the same being. In that older framework, the violent frenzy could echo a bull's fury in combat, and the central conflict over the bull could reflect ritual storytelling connected to fertility, land, and seasonal power. If that kind of ritual origin ever existed, a later stage would naturally reverse the relationship. Instead of the god being the bull, the god becomes the hero who kills the bull. This flip happens in many traditions once a divine animal stops being treated as a direct incarnation and starts being treated as a sacrifice offered to the deity. Myth adapts. The god doesn't die as the bull. The god conquers the bull. That would help explain why some versions keep the bull at the centre, but reshape the ending. adding a rival bull and turning the finale into a dramatic animal duel. Real-world cattle raiding customs could then reshape the old myth even further, until the story becomes the form we recognise. Finally, when you compare the Cu Chulin tradition with the Fion tradition, you can see why they feel so different. The Cu Chulin world has one giant anchor story, the cattle raid, and that gives it stronger unity. The Fion world is looser and more expandable, almost endlessly open to new parts because it lived more as a people's saga. That difference alone can explain why Fion stories spread so widely in folk memory, while Cu Chulin stories often feel like a more fixed, heroic epic with a sealed core. Sometimes the two worlds borrow from each other, but a lot of the similarities don't require borrowing at all. They come from the simple reality that heroic traditions everywhere pull in the same kind of story material. Once a hero becomes famous, the universal library of mythic adventures rushes in and attaches itself. After Cumul, the father of Fion, is killed, the spotlight swings to a new lineup of legendary stars. At the centre stands Fion himself, then his son Oisin, his grandson Oscar, and the famous Diarmid, the man marked by a beauty spot so powerful that no woman could resist him. Around them you also get Fergus, respected for wisdom and smooth speech, Caolte, the lightning-fast runner, Conan, the built-in comic troublemaker, and Gol Macmorna, the man who once killed Cumul but later becomes one of Fion's most loyal allies. Their lives revolve around the classic, heroic ingredients you see in epic traditions everywhere: hunting, fighting, feasts, and love stories that can turn sweet or deadly in a heartbeat. And through it all, the saga shows a very Celtic mix of qualities: quick spirit, courage, warmth, tenderness, and also a love of boasting and sudden flashes of temper. Even though the roots of these stories reach back into pagan times, they don't function like a clear guidebook to ancient religion. What they do give you, vividly, is the lifestyle, the values, and the social atmosphere that later generations imagined as the heroic age. One thing that stands out strongly is the place of women. They are not treated as mere property. They argue, choose, resist, command, and shape the plot, often with far more agency than you might expect from early heroic storytelling. It's also important to understand how this saga works. It was never born as one single, perfectly unified epic. Think of it more like a huge collection of parts that originally lived independently. Stories told in different places, by different voices across different centuries, but all carrying the same spirit, the same heroic cast, and the same emotional world. Over time, people began to connect these parts into a wider timeline, but the saga always kept that flexible, expandable feel. New material kept joining the tradition right into the modern era, and later poems about Oisin in Tir na Nog can feel just as authentic within the tradition as much older pieces. A lot of it was written down, but even more of it lived orally, in prose tales, ballads, and wild folk stories where universal fairy tale patterns are reshaped into something unmistakably Irish, with Fion and his band dropped straight into the centre. Some historians and annal writers tried to explain the Fiana in practical terms. Not supernatural heroes, but a kind of national militia. In this version, Irish kings maintained them to protect the realm. Half the year they were lodged among the people, and the other half they lived by hunting. Legends even describe their field life in detail. How they cooked game in earth ovens with hot stones. How they built beds from layers of branches and moss. How they organised their forces into large units with commanders and officers. And how brutal the entry tests were for anyone trying to join. Once admitted, a warrior had to obey strict personal taboos, gyasa, rules like never harming women, refusing to retreat unless overwhelmed, and choosing a wife for character rather than wealth. That historical portrait may preserve faint memories of real warrior bands, but it is swollen with heroic exaggeration. The numbers are too neat, the trials too extreme, the system too perfect. And that's the key. Even in the parts that claim to be realistic, the Fiana never behave like ordinary people. Their world is full of giants, impossible feats, and constant supernatural pressure. If a story is built mostly from otherworld encounters and mythic action, then the characters themselves can't be treated as normal historical figures. Whether a real Fion or Oisin ever lived matters far less than what the tradition turned them into. The favourite heroes of popular imagination, figures so loved that people believed in them with the same seriousness they believed in the landscape. That popularity is one of the saga's biggest clues. Cu Chulin's stories were often more at home among learned and aristocratic audiences. Fion's stories, by contrast, lived in the mouths of ordinary people. For every person who could tell a Cu Chulin tale, there were countless who could tell a Fion one. This has led to an intriguing idea. Perhaps the Fion tradition began among older, pre-Celtic communities in Ireland and Scotland, and was later adopted by the Celts, then fully Celticized over time. Conquerors often absorb the heroes and beliefs of the people they conquer, especially once centuries pass and cultures blend. If that happened here, it could explain why the Fion world stays somewhat separate from the older myth cycles, even though it sometimes brushes against them. It could also explain why Fion stories are rooted not just in Ireland, but all across the Highlands too, with place names in both regions claiming Fiana connections, as if the saga belongs to the shared ground itself. Inside the story world, the Fiana are not just fighting rival Irish provinces. They also battle enemies from over the sea, often called the Lochlanners. Sometimes that word can mean real foreigners, but in older layers it likely points to something more mythic. Hostile beings from beyond the water, almost like Ireland's version of supernatural raiders. Later, history blurred this, so that Viking invaders became the real Lochlanners in popular imagination. And suddenly, Fion is fighting Norsemen in stories that clearly don't belong to actual history. Some scholars tried to push the saga's origin into the Viking era, and even claimed Fion himself was partly Norse. But that raises more problems than it solves. It's hard to see why a half-Norse hero would become the chosen symbol of Celtic pride during centuries of conflict. If there are Norse echoes, they could come from many directions. Older contacts across the sea, shared story patterns, or simple independent invention, because similar societies often create similar legends. When you zoom in on the main story beats, the saga gives you several unforgettable signature arcs. One is the origin of Fion himself. His father Cumal wants to marry Muin, but her father, a powerful druid, refuses, fearing the loss of his inheritance. Cumal takes Muin anyway. War follows, Cumal is killed, and Muin flees to safety where she gives birth to a child first known as Demni, later renamed Fion. The tale also links him to the older divine world through family lines, which quietly pushes the story back toward myth, even when it pretends to be history. Soon the young Fion appears at the king's court and proves himself by defeating a supernatural threat that returns every year to destroy the royal stronghold. His reward is more than praise. He gains leadership of the Fiana, reclaiming what belonged to his father. Another famous moment explains Fion's thumb of knowledge. A sacred salmon is believed to grant inspiration and deep insight. Fion is told to cook it but not taste it. He burns his thumb, puts it into his mouth, and instantly the knowledge enters him. From that day on, whenever he needs an answer, he simply sucks his thumb and receives hidden information. It's myth logic again. Wisdom becomes a physical gift, stored in the body like a secret key he can activate at will. Oisín's origin story carries the same enchantment. His mother, Sa, is turned into a faun by druid magic and fleas. Later, Fion finds a strange child in the forest, part wild creature, part human, and recognizes him as his son. As the boy grows, the animal nature fades, and he is named Oisín, little faun. From there, Oisín becomes more than a warrior. He becomes the ideal poet, the voice of the Gaelic, heroic world, even eclipsing Fion in artistic fame. But the most emotionally explosive storyline is the tragedy of Diarmaid and Grain. Gran is promised to Fion, yet she falls for Diarmaid. She places Gyasa on him, binding taboos that he cannot break, forcing him to flee with her. The chase becomes legendary. Days of pursuit, narrow escapes, the band divided between loyalty to Fion and love for Diarmaid. In the end, the Fiana compel Fion to forgive. But the story never lets the wound heal. Fion waits, and when the chance comes, he uses Diarmaid's own geese against him. Diarmaid is forbidden to hunt a wild boar, yet he is invited on a boar hunt and cannot refuse. He kills the beast, and then a bristle pierces his heel. Dying, he begs Fion to bring water in his hands, because that alone can heal him. Fion brings it, and lets it spill away, again and again, until Diarmaid dies. No matter how heroic Fion is elsewhere, this moment stains him permanently. As the saga moves toward its ending, it shifts into a twilight mood. Some stories send Fiana warriors into lands beyond the sea, into realms under waves, into enchanted palaces that trap them like dreams. Then comes the breaking of the band itself. In one tradition, Fion is warned never to drink from a horn. One day he forgets, breaks the taboo, and the fall begins. He is drawn into a fatal conflict with enemies tied to an old wrong, and he dies. After that, the Fiana are shattered in a series of battles, with only a handful surviving. And then, the saga performs one of its most dramatic time jumps. The survivors meet Saint Patrick. Caolte remains in the human world. Oisín, linked through his mother to the fairy people, spends time in the Otherworld and later returns. In the most famous later version, Oisín rides to Tir na Nog with its queen, living there in what feels like a few dreamlike days. But when homesickness strikes, he returns on a magical horse with one strict warning: never touch Irish soil. He arrives and finds centuries have passed. He tries to help weak men lift a stone, steps down, and instantly collapses into extreme old age, the entire weight of time crashing onto him at once. Soon after, he meets Patrick and tells his story. What makes all of this powerful is how the Christian world is shown responding to the old heroes. In a medieval narrative built around Patrick and the last Fiana, the saint listens as Caolte tells story after story, tied to place names across the land. At first, Patrick worries these tales might distract from prayer. Then an angel tells him to listen, and to have the stories written down. So the clerics become an audience, praising the storytelling while also folding it into a Christian frame. In the end, the old warriors are baptized, and the tale even dares to imagine Fion himself being brought out of hell through Patrick's prayers. It's a symbolic handshake across centuries. Pagan legend and Christian Ireland sharing the same stage, neither fully erased, both reinterpreted. When you move into the later Highland and Irish ballads, the tone shifts sharply. In some 16th century Highland songs and later Irish manuscripts, the meeting between Saint Patrick and the Fiana is no longer gentle or respectful. Instead, it becomes a clash. The saint is stern, harsh, sometimes almost bitter. The Fiana are proud, defiant pagans who refuse to bow easily. There is no soft reconciliation here. In some versions, Patrick openly rejoices that Fion and his warriors are in hell, while Oisin fires back with contempt for the god of the shaven priests. Yet even in these confrontations, there is something more than anger. There is humour. There is grief. There is a deep ache beneath the insults. Oisin, now old and weary, looks back on the vanished world of the Fiana with tears in his eyes. The soundscape of Christian Ireland, church bells, chanting, psalms, feels to him like noise compared to the freedom of the forest and the clash of weapons. The saint may offer him shelter, but the old warrior cannot stop mourning the lost glory of his companions. These harsher ballads likely reflect one real phase of the Church's reaction to pagan memory, a period when the old heroes were seen as dangerous relics of a fading belief system. But that is not the whole picture. Other versions soften the edges. In some songs, Oisin is urged gently toward the new faith. He prays for salvation. The hostility fades into something more reflective. By that point, Christianity was firmly rooted in Ireland. There was no realistic threat of a pagan comeback. That changed everything. Once the old religion no longer posed a danger, it became possible to treat the old heroes with admiration, as long as they were reshaped, baptized, or spiritually redeemed. This shift reaches its fullest expression in the famous medieval dialogue between Patrick and the last of the Fiana. In that telling, Patrick listens as Chulin recounts one legend after another, each tied to hills, rivers, and place names across Ireland. At first, the saint worries that such tales distract from devotion. Then comes a turning point. He is encouraged not only to listen, but to preserve them. The old warriors are baptized. Fion himself is praised as a king, a poet, a seer, a figure of grandeur rather than a villain. Cu Chulin even claims that the Fiana knew of the true God in their own way, that there was truth in their hearts, strength in their arms, and honesty in their speech. In this version, pagan heroism and Christian virtue are not enemies. They are reinterpreted as compatible. This more generous approach may have grown out of a broader change in perspective. As Christian culture matured, it became more confident. It could afford to look back at the pagan past without fear. And perhaps exposure to continental chivalric romances also helped shape a new appreciation for heroic ideals, regardless of their religious origin. What we see in these reconciliatory versions is not compromise out of weakness, but reinterpretation out of confidence. Irish storytelling returns again and again to this dramatic meeting of ages. The old gods, demigods, and heroes stand face to face with saints. Sometimes they resist. Sometimes they convert. Sometimes they simply fade. Few European traditions explore this tension so vividly. The old world not erased, but placed in dialogue with the new. And then we reach the most controversial chapter in the saga's modern life. James Macpherson and his Ossian. Did he uncover a lost Celtic epic? No manuscript in his handwriting's shadow has ever been produced to prove it. But it would be unfair to dismiss him as a pure fraud. He clearly knew real Gaelic ballads and tales. He saw that they shared themes, recurring figures, and a certain unity. He realized they could be shaped into something larger, something epic in scope. What he did next was bold. He gathered fragments, rearranged them, invented transitions, expanded scenes, altered personalities, and presented the result as a direct translation from an ancient source. That claim was the deception. But the creative act itself required genuine talent. He built an epic that Europe was ready to embrace. Writers and thinkers across the continent, from Napoleon to Goethe, were captivated. His version of Ossian gave readers a misty, emotional, heroic landscape that felt fresh compared to the strict classical models of the 18th century. But when you compare his polished, sentimental heroes with the raw figures of the authentic saga, the difference is striking. In the older tales, warriors are brutal, flawed, and sometimes shocking. Their world contains cruelty alongside tenderness, savage customs beside real devotion, magic intertwined with daily life. The supernatural is not foggy or abstract, it is embodied, physical, terrifying. Even the ghosts have weight and presence. In contrast, Macpherson's spirits drift like pale shadows. His heroes are almost always noble and victorious. His tone leans toward romantic melancholy rather than fierce vitality. He even blends together story worlds that remain largely separate in the genuine tradition. And yet, for all that, his work mattered. It reshaped European literary taste. It captured the longing of an age searching for something beyond rigid formalism. It may not be historically authentic, but it was emotionally powerful. Still, if you want to feel the real heartbeat of Celtic legend, you return to the older saga itself, in its manuscripts, in its ballads, in the wild folk versions carried by memory. There you find a world that loves mountains and forests, sea winds and birdsong. You find warriors fierce in rage and generous in victory. You find women strong-willed and luminous. You find magic that feels close to the earth. And beneath it all, you hear that distinct Celtic undertone, a music of longing and loss, a sense that glory is always fading just beyond reach. Across Celtic myth, the gods are not simply larger versions of human beings, but they are not entirely separate either. Between mortals and full divinities stand the great heroic figures, part human, part divine, sometimes former gods themselves reshaped into legendary champions. These figures feel like a bridge between two worlds. One of the striking traits of Celtic divine beings is sheer scale. They are immense. Bran is said to be so huge that no house could contain him. Otherworld visitors appear wearing rings so thick they seem built for giants. Even the Fiana, in later legend, are described as towering figures whose bones dwarf ordinary men. This exaggerated stature isn't random decoration. It signals that these beings belong to a different order of existence. They also move through reality differently. The gods can appear or vanish at will. They reveal themselves only to chosen individuals, or hide within magical mists. When they interact with humans, they often adopt human form, sometimes even copying a specific person. Yet they also shift into animals, especially birds. Some divine names clearly began as animal names, suggesting that certain gods may once have been imagined purely in animal form before becoming human-shaped. Later myths then explained why a god might appear as a swan, a raven, or a bull, preserving older layers of belief beneath newer storytelling. Immortality is another key feature, but not always simple immortality. The divine race, known as the Tuatha de Danan, are described as unfading, enduring without decay. Sometimes their endless life is innate. In other stories, it depends on special food or drink, enchanted pigs, immortal ale, apples from the Otherworld. Even when myths speak of divine deaths, those stories may reflect ritual patterns rather than literal endings. In many ancient religions, the god of growth or vegetation dies and returns through ritual performance. It's possible that something similar once existed among the Celts, where the death of a divine representative was part of maintaining life and fertility. The boundary between gods and humans is constantly crossed. Goddesses fall in love with mortal heroes. Gods take mortal lovers. Heroes are born from unions between divine and human parents. This wasn't just poetic imagery. Inscriptions across Celtic lands preserve names that literally mean son of or born from a particular deity. People believed that divine ancestry was real. Even names meaning son of the sea or similar titles suggest that forces of nature were imagined as actual parents of human lineages. Because of this connection, the gods don't stand distant from human affairs. They intervene. They protect their offspring. They seek help from mortals when needed. The divine and the human worlds interlock constantly, especially in saga narratives. This blending becomes even more visible when you look at kingship. Many Celtic rulers bore divine names. Some were directly identified with mythic gods. In certain traditions, a king is described as an earthly god. This may not be metaphorical. Early societies often treated kings as divine representatives, living embodiments of a god's power. Prosperity was tied to them. Good harvests, mild seasons, abundant fish and cattle, all were believed to depend on the king observing his sacred taboos correctly. Those taboos, known as geasa, were not minor rules. They were sacred restrictions that bound the king's life to the well-being of the land. If the king failed, the land failed. This connection strongly suggests that kings were once viewed as incarnations of fertility deities. In cultures where divine kingship exists, the king's vitality and the land's fertility are inseparable. In extreme cases, the king might even be killed before old age weakened him, so that his strength could symbolically renew the land. Sometimes a substitute, a mock king, would die in his place. Scattered hints in Irish tradition and later folklore suggest that similar ideas once existed among the Celts. The same blurred boundary may have existed between kings and priests. In some regions, priesthood and kingship may originally have been the same office. Certain Celtic councils met at sacred groves, Nematin, places that were both political and religious centres. Some rulers were skilled in divination and acted in priestly roles. In a few cases, priestly titles hint at divine claims. It's possible that as society evolved, the roles of priest and king gradually separated, but not everywhere at once. Where they remained combined, the ruler could claim sacred authority. Where they separated, priests may have preserved ritual control while kings retained political power. The king's symbolic link to the land often took physical form through trees. Sacred trees, especially great oaks, stood at the centre of ritual life. The king might carry a branch cut from such a tree as a sign of his authority. The life of the king and the life of the sacred tree may once have been seen as connected. If the tree withered, so did the king. If the king fell, the tree might be cut down. Later, traditions insist that such trees could not be touched without sacrilege, suggesting their enormous symbolic power. There may even be echoes of this in the famous ritual described by classical writers involving the cutting of mistletoe from an oak. Mistletoe could have been understood as the soul of the tree, something that had to be removed before the tree itself could be harmed. Over time, if human sacrifice became restricted or forbidden, animals may have replaced human victims in these rites. Later romantic stories, where a hero's power is bound to a branch he carries or guards, may preserve faint shadows of these older ritual ideas. If, in an even earlier phase, fertility was imagined as feminine, embodied by a goddess of growth, her representative may have been a woman, possibly even sacrificed in ritual settings. When male deities rose to dominance, the divine priest-king could replace the earlier female embodiment. Yet the feminine presence never vanished entirely. The sacred marriage ritual, where a divine bride symbolically joins the king, echoes through later folk customs, like the May Queen tradition. In some local practices, women alone carry the ritual role, hinting at a time when female divine representation stood at the centre. Taken together, these patterns reveal a world-view where gods, heroes, kings, trees, fertility, and ritual are deeply interwoven. The divine was not remote. It moved through bloodlines, landscapes, seasons, and rulers. Heroes stood halfway between heaven and earth. Kings carried sacred life in their bodies. Trees held spiritual power. And behind the myths lies the possibility of ritual practices that once gave these stories their living force.